I just speak a little louder.
Mr. McGregor? Commissioner, I was just making sure y'all could hear us.
We can hear you.
Perfect. And so
Good
I
morning.
think we're waiting. Commissioner Blair is on her way. And then I think Mr. Bering's going to join. We're just going to give him just a minute and then we'll get started.
Perfect.
Thank y'all. Good morning, Mr. Reese.
Good morning. I was on mute.
Yeah.
Sarah, yeah, he didn't have my name on the list at the.
I'm also not able to get in, so I'm not able to assist. So good morning, everyone. It is 9:04 a.m. This is a meeting of the Zoning Ordinance Advisory Committee. Thanks everyone for being here this morning on a warm morning. Ms. May, can we start with the roll call, please?
Yes, Chair Hampton,
Present?
Mr. Hall,
Here.
Mr. McGregor,
Present.
Ms. Bagley,
Here.
Mr. Reeves,
I'm here.
and I think we're waiting on Commissioner Popkin and Mr. Berry
And Vice Chair Blair.
and Vice Chair Blake.
And I know at least two of them are en route or trying to log in, so we'll circle back on that. So we have a quorum for the meeting. We have one discussion item on our agenda. Mr. Dawes, would you please read the item into the record and give us an update?
I will.
As soon as
I'm
you're
trying to-
able to
I'm
get
trying
into
send
your-
an email to Brian to tell him how I got in.
Okay.
Maybe Mr. Barron can get in that way. I guess, I think we're still on the delay. Okay, that's not as bad as it used to be. So our, as we all know, our item today is we're discussing the child care amendments again. So this is consideration of amending chapters 51 and 51A of the Dallas Development Code, with consideration to be given to amending sections 51-4.2044 child care facility, 51-4.2046 adult daycare facility, 51-4.217B10 day home, 51A-4.2041 adult daycare facility, 51A-4.2043 child care facility, 51A-4.217B7.1 day home, 51A-13.306B use chart, and related sections, with consideration to be given to appropriate zoning districts and developing appropriate standards associated with adult daycare facilities and child care facilities. So as we know, we've discussed this a couple times before, but the proposed code amendments on the staff recommendation side recommend that we remove the requirement for SUP for these facilities in residential districts and create an allowance for special exception to certain regulations. Those would be decided by the Board of Adjustments. And also there are amendments to terminology and as some related amendments as we've discussed. Of course, as you know, this was a code amendment initiated by CPC in December 2022. And we, staff determined that it was appropriate to add for some consideration, day home item, which are those accessory uses. Just kind of a quick review, we're looking at specifically childcare facilities, adult daycare facilities, and day homes. We're not included in this discussion. We're not really talking about public, private schools, institutional uses like nursing homes or convalescent homes, handicapped dwelling units, assisted living facilities, retirement housing, or other residential uses, really focusing on childcare and adult daycare facilities and that accessory use, which we call a day home. You've seen all these slides before, but just like to kind of make sure after a couple weeks we're back on track of looking at considering the needs that exist in the city of Dallas. And this is new information that we were able to do a little bit more research, but according to the 2022 American Communities Survey, 5-year estimates, and then looking at that combined with state of Texas HHS information about license capacity. There are approximately 93,000 children under the age of 5 in Dallas, and there are approximately 35,000 licensed child care slots, as I like to call them. So that we determine the number of slots, quote unquote, by looking at the licensed child care facilities and in-home care facilities. that are currently licensed in the city of Dallas. And every state license includes a capacity maximum for that facility. Of course, that's based on numerous factors, but there's about 35,000 slots for 93,000 children under 5. Now, of course, there is a gap here of licensed child care facilities are allowed to provide care for up to ages 12. And we didn't look at that. We kind of assumed that if they're over 5, they're in a public or private school. Because we don't, and there's no way to determine the actual number of where that gap is of how many between 6 and 12 need childcare versus don't need childcare. But in general, we're looking at about, there's capacity to care for about 37% of the children under age of 5 in the city of Dallas today. A couple other kind of research gaps are how many children reside in Dallas but are provided care in a city that's not Dallas. It's a number we could take a guess, but it would be a pure guess. There's really not even a way to estimate that. So, but that's a pretty sizable gap. 63% of children under the age of 5 in Dallas, there's not capacity in the city of Dallas for them to be cared for outside of their own home. So some updates from the May 30th meeting, specifically on the permitted districts. Just kind of as a quick reminder, staff recommendation is to permit the new combined child and adult daycare facility. Staff recommends that we permit that use by right in all residential districts, retail, mixed use, multiple commercial, office, and urban corridor districts, and by SUP and CS and industrial districts. And then we can have 2 similar but slightly different options that were discussed by ZOAC. The real kind of difference in these in A and B is that under option A, that would be in non-multifamily residential districts, so your Rs and your THs and your CHs and manufactured homes. If that proposed facility is within 1,000 feet of another child or adult daycare facility, SUP would be required. And then option B is that those same categories, same districts, so the Rs, the CHs, the CHs, and the MHs, it's a by right use, but only if there's 12 or fewer attendees. Staff does not recommend option B purely because, to be frank, there's no way of enforcing or tracking that 12 attendee limit. Because this would still require a CO. They're going to come in, and basically there's just not a way for the city to keep track of that, to enforce it, and that may change on a daily basis, the number of children that they care for. The other side of this is that it's already up to 12 is already permitted as that accessory day home use. So it's kind of doubling up on a thing that you can already do. And then that kind of also just introduces confusion on, well, can I do it here? Can I not do it? Is it accessory? Is it not accessory? So we wanted to include that option just to kind of write it down and put it on paper. But there's just not really a way to enforce it. So it's not the path that staff recommends.
And it really just removes the resident from.
Yeah, the only thing that does is just.
Can you go back to the slide for just a
Yes.
sec? Or is it, it's not written, I didn't notice that anywhere, or maybe I missed it.
It's in the signification report. In the proposed amendments,
Okay.
it's in boxes, and I think there's a little bit of discussion of it.
Page 15.
Okay. I thought it- Maybe I read it at the middle of the night.
Great stuff.
Thank you. Mr. Blair, Vice Chair Blair.
14 and 15.
14 and 15. Oh, there they are. I see them. Mm-hmm.
And then we also had some discussion about parking. So as a reminder, staff recommendation is essentially no parking minimums. ZOAC requested that we add in one required space for facilities in R75 and R5 and TH districts. 2 spaces in all other residential districts, and then no minimum in the non-residential districts. That also is in boxes in the proposed amendments. So this is, so this list, it matches the list that's on, I don't know what page it is, the last page of the actual case report before you get to the amendments or the appendices. So I'll just run through these and then we'll open it up for discussion and questions. So staff recommendation for this item is to, 1, combine the main uses of adult daycare and child care facility into one use called child or adult daycare facility. Permit the newly combined main use in residential districts by right in lieu of ICP as currently is required. 3, require an SUP in commercial services and industrial districts where today it's permitted. Lot coverage and are allowed to use in residential districts, and just limit them to the residential district, the residential use limits in those districts. 5, add a provision to limit the hours of outdoor activities for child and adult daycare facilities in residential districts with residential adjacency. That is basically to match it to the day home hour limitation. 6 is to add a provision that allows the Board of Adjustment to approve special exceptions to outdoor, special exceptions to place outdoor recreational structures and parking in setbacks. 7, allow child and adult daycare facilities to determine how much off-street parking is needed for them and to not specify minimum parking requirements. 8, update the accessory use day home definition to allow use for adults and children, and increasing the maximum number of attendees from 10 to 12. That's to bring that up to the HHS standard or maximum. And then 9, of course, that ever present to update for outdated references and terminology throughout those chapters that we're looking at. So next steps after this meeting would be ZOAC action, then take it to CPC for a public hearing, briefing or public hearing, and then City Council for public hearing and final action. So that we're all here, fire away.
Thank you, Mr. Doss.
And if you want me to go to any particular slide, just yell it out and I will get us there.
So I believe it's page 12 is where those summary staff recommendations are, if anyone needs those for reference. And with that, we'll open it up for discussion. Mr. Holt? Yeah. Mr. McGregor.
I have 2 questions. Okay. In staff's opinion, what drives the desire of a person or company or whatever to open a new daycare in whatever form? Is it market forces? There's a perception that this is needed in this neighborhood, or?
I don't think we know exactly what drives them, but I know that the state and federal government are actively seeking to give grant money to businesses to open childcare facilities. The church that I attend, they want to open up a preschool, and they've been granted a lot of money to be able to open. So it's something that the state and federal government recognizes as a desperate need it's really difficult to open just for the cost and everything. And so they're trying lots of programs to try to encourage people to open up childcare facilities, just because the regulatory barriers are so great with the state, and startup costs are, like any business, really expensive, and not to mention all the equipment and all the the thing and the training and the staffing. But I would assume, as far as what drives them, I guess people probably feel called to do it.
I think it's like I don't own a business or run a business, but my feeling would be that, and I think this is true for any business. If there's a demand, it will be filled. I don't necessarily believe that people should open businesses for fun. I think if there's a demand that they see, they try to fill it. And if they're wrong, they're wrong. If they're right, they're right.
So there must be a perception, at least there is on the part of governments, that this is needed, and that is an effort of governments to perhaps make society better in some way. But I can't imagine that a business would open something unless they're, without having a perception or at least some sort of research that there's a definite need. I mean, definitely some neighborhoods might have a greater need because of more children. Other neighborhoods might not. But like you say, it can't be cheap just to do it. Second, excluding churches and schools, what form do these, if you're going to open a daycare, would you be thinking, I'm going into an existing house, or I need to build, a purpose building or something? It can't be cheap to do either one if you have to install sprinkler systems and fire suppression and things like that. But do they typically go into existing homes? Let's say if we're going into a single family residential, are they moving into an existing home, or do they say we need to build an entirely new building?
So I think it's kind of the same with what drives someone to open one. Whatever better suits their needs is what they're going to do. I would say that based on my knowledge, it's a lot easier to build a new facility than it would be to renovate, especially a home, to bring a home up to commercial building code, which is what would be required to get a CO, would be a whole lot of money and a whole lot of work and a whole lot of headache. So I don't think personally that that would be common. Certainly doable, certainly possible. And we've seen it happen for different uses. But I do think that the state standards for these facilities are fairly rigorous and very well enforced at the state level. As an anecdotal, my mom worked for a daycare for a number of years, preschool daycare, in a church. And it was state licensed and everything. And it was, they truly did not know when inspectors would visit. They would drop in unannounced for their kind of reviews, and I don't know what they call them, inspections. And if anything was out of line, it was a problem. So I think that if I were to do it personally, I would build a new building, because that's the only way that I'm going to really know for certain that I'm going to meet all the standards that I need to meet.
If you were going to be legal about it. If you're not going to be legal, you would. And I guess just finally, the 1,000-foot spacing, does that make sense from a business point of view? Or, I could see, I'm having trouble visualizing in a neighborhood what 1,000 feet is.
Sure.
But it seems like a fairly significant distance.
So
I don't know, but.
Probably about 2 or 3 blocks of your old style, small block, block size.
I can do some math. Hold on, Van, walk me through
Oh,
some
okay.
So, I think that number, it started off at 500 maybe. Maybe it started off at 0 and then it went to 500, now it's 1,000. I just don't know from a need or a business point of view if that number is strictly arbitrary or does it make sense? I don't know.
If I can ask a supporting, are there other provisions in our code that use a similar spacing requirement?
Steve, what uses 1,000?
So, handicap
group
group
homes.
homes uses 1,000, group homes.
Group homes use 1,000.
I'm sorry, what?
The handicap group dwelling units, group homes use 1,000 feet. That comes from the federal government saying you can't limit them to any. They've said that 1,000 feet is the largest buffer that a city can place. That either federal or state has said that. My understanding is that ultimately it's just arbitrary. 1,000 feet could be 2 blocks, could be a block, depends on the neighborhood is built. In my research, I have not happened upon an actual reason for any number, whether it's 500, 1,000, a quarter mile, 2 miles. It's kind of whatever got the yes vote at the time that's what I've kind of landed on, is where these numbers come from. 1,000 feet. So if we're looking at like a 65-foot wide lot, that's about a block, that's about 520 feet. So you're looking at anywhere from 2 blocks to, plus or minus some. And once you include right of way in that, you kind of really start to limit where these things can go. That's my answer.
Yeah, I'm just trying to envision, if there was a very high concentration of children that needed daycare, 1,000 feet might seem pretty restrictive. If there was a neighborhood that didn't have a significant number of children, then 1,000 feet might not be a big deal. And I don't know, I know it's going to vary from areas to areas. Okay.
And if I could, elaborate on that.
Yes.
With the day homes, they're limited to 8 people, plus the caregiver, I think is how the day homes work. So they are.
It's definitive these.
No, sorry, not day home, sorry. Handicap group dwelling unit, sorry. I said the completely wrong thing. So for a handicap group dwelling unit, those are meant to be in a single family home, restricted to a certain number of people. And so there's like a size cap on those uses. And they are intended to go into single family, homes. Whereas, a childcare facility, as Stephen mentioned, has all these ADA requirements, exiting, the educational occupancy type of size of rooms and, all these other requirements for life and safety reasons, that we don't think that we're going to see an extreme number of them, unless, they want to do a day home and just, well, they're still going to have to get a CO. So, if it's just the problem of having, the proximity is just a different fact. It's apples and oranges in our opinion, between the day home, the group, handicap group dwelling units and a child care facility. The regulatory maximum people through the state and from the city are not the same, and it's probably not going to be in single family buildings generally.
And answer your questions.
I guess, yeah, I mean, it was interesting that you said the federal government is sort of throwing money at the problem, and that's sort of scary in a way. I'm sure their intents are good, but I could see people coming in and saying, hey, there's money to be made in setting up these places. But there are, to do it legally, there are a lot of barriers and cost in doing it. So I think it's not necessarily fly by night kind of a thing. But to do it illegally is another issue. And okay.
Just anecdotally, the preschool that I'm, obliquely involved in, their grant is only good for like 50% of the startup cost, and they have to start running a daycare in order to not have to pay back. And there's strings attached, of course, with all grant money, my understanding.
Sure.
So it doesn't take away, the burden of starting up a business, but it's intended to help. It's really difficult.
Sure.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Hall. So I'd like to acknowledge that Vice Chair Blair arrived at 9:10 a.m. Mr. Bering joined us online at 9:20, and I believe I neglected to mention that Commissioner Carpenter is also with us as well. With that, Mr. McGregor, I saw your hand next.
Looks like it's maybe frozen.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Mr. Dawes, I have a question, and I'm sorry, sometimes when I have a question on this level of detail, I would have sent it to you ahead of time, but I just noticed this today. I'm focused on the amount of in-home facilities versus sort of more institutional childcare centers. And I want to ask you, my question goes to page number 6 in your report, item number 3, where it says HHS licenses in Dallas generally. It gives us an estimate of the number of facilities. The part that I just noticed this morning is that the math is off. The third line says that 281 facilities are HHS licensed childcare centers. Of these, it says 112 are in-home. I think you meant, well, I imagine you meant 212. Otherwise, the math doesn't work. So that would be the first part, to verify that that's meant to be 212. And then the remaining 59 are a set of other things. On those 59, I'm trying to understand what exactly these are. Are they something that I would see as a more of a institutional childcare center, or what is a school age program, before and after school program? And I do understand the small employer based facility. Does this make sense?
Absolutely. So we'll check the math. I think Sarah's doing that for me now, to my embarrassment. But so the small employer base, I'll start there. There's only 3 of those in Dallas. One is at a veterinary clinic, and then the other 2 are, I honestly just can't remember. There's only 3 of them, and their capacity is very, very limited. They know exactly how many kids, and probably they know that in 2 years they're going to be done and they don't need childcare anymore. The school age program is essentially, it's for children who are typically, what those are. A school age program is going to be your summer camps.
I see.
So, for example, there's a summer camp at the Y. They don't typically provide daycare services during the full year, so they go to HHS and get the school age program license, and that permits them to provide care for specific ages during the typical school day, and it allows them to do that year round. But when I looked at the actual programs, they are almost universally summer programs. Music camp, sports camp, any of those kind of things. Additionally, even like I believe the Pro Museum has a license for a school age program. I went to their website, I looked it up, and it's like a 2-week during the day, drop off your kids and come get them later program. So that's really typically what those are. Before and after school program, those are almost universally at schools, mostly public schools, and that is exactly what it sounds like, providing care before and or after the typical, what they HHS call typical school day.
Thank you. So are the when I think of an institutional child care center, are they not? Is this saying that there aren't any in Dallas, or am I not seeing them in the numbers? Because I see the ones that you just described and the in-home facilities.
Sure. So the bulk of these, the licensed child care center, at 281, are anything from I don't want to use the word for-profit, but a non-affiliated program, a company that sets up a preschool that is purely not affiliated with the church or other institution. But that licensed child care facility tag also would include a church or another place of worship that also operates childcare during the week. So it's capturing both. The city of Dallas, for whatever reason, has placed all of these childcare facilities. We've called them an institutional use, but it does not actually require or stipulate that they have to be affiliated with what we would traditionally consider.
Okay. I understand. I understand. So then I think maybe I misused the word institutional. I'm sort of a visual person. I'm thinking of a facility that does not look like a home. It'll say child care center in the front. It might have a commercial looking sign, different from in-home. Where in these numbers would those fit? I just feel like I'm missing something really obvious. Everybody sees it and I don't.
So if it's a commercial building, that provides childcare, that would fall most likely, into the licensed childcare center category.
But, right, but again, is it under the 112 or the 59?
It'd be in the 281.
And, well, no, but 281 here is broken up into 112 and 59, right? Or am I reading this
No.
wrong?
No. So there's three broad categories.
I see. Okay.
281 licensed childcare facilities. There are 112 in-home facilities, and there are 59 school age, before and after school, and small employer based.
Okay, I got it. I was reading this wrong, and your math is probably fine.
Okay, great.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Always good to check them out.
No, it's not.
Members, other questions?
I have,
Vice Chair Blair.
I would like to focus my questions on single-family districts. And it's difficult to discuss licensed versus non-licensed, but I'm gonna try. In a single-family district, and I know that staff feels that this should be a by right, and it should be amongst families. But in your report, it says that parking should be one space.
This is staff.
Zero, your staff is zero. ZOAC is one space.
One or two.
One or two spaces. Has staff looked at and or considered if you have 10, and the recommendation is for 10 children, right? Or unlimited amount of children in a residential facility?
So staff doesn't feel that the city has the adequate expertise, knowledge, or ability to enforce a maximum number of children, because that capacity is set by the state. It's based on teacher to child ratios. It's based on square footage, based on a whole host of things that we simply don't.
Okay, so let me throw something out. Catch it. If we have a single family home that is sizable enough and staffed appropriately enough to have 10 or 12 little ones, and theoretically, hypothetically and theoretically, the general workday starts at 8 and ends at 5, correct? And if you have only, well, as staff recommends, 0 parking requirements, ZOAC is 1 or 2. And you have a single family with parking automatically being utilized on both sides of the street, and all of a sudden you have 12 different cars, trucks, driving into this residential community. At the same time, people are trying to get out and go to work, or trying to get in and come home. Conceivably, has staff made a consideration what that is going to look like for that community?
Would it surprise you to know that if a resident lived in that house, it's already allowed by right, with no extra parking right now?
Yes, it would. It would surprise me, amaze me. But they have 2 spots at least.
One or two, depending on the zoning district.
Mhm.
because of the main use being single family.
Okay. But what I'm saying is if you have an in-home daycare, home care, whatever title you want to give this, with, and if you also saying, okay, by right, and you have four all in the same block.
That's already allowed.
I know it's already allowed, but I'm saying to personify this ability and the impacts it have on a residential community. My question for staff is, can you help me understand your rationale behind unlimited lists and your recommendations on parking with no parking requirements and not tailoring this so that you have at least a spacing? I don't believe, or can you help me understand, is staff's recommendation that it's okay to concentrate business in residential territory?
And I would say that I
You loaded it at the end. You loaded the question.
Did you like that?
I would just add that while use definitions, this one does talk about for-profit or not-for-profit. I would say that this type of use specifically, it was placed in the institutional use category and not the retail category, ostensibly for some purpose when it was done in 1965 and 51. So I think that by itself is an acknowledgement that childcare as a use is not analogous to a grocery store in terms of how the city considers where does it fall on the spectrum of residential versus commerce uses. It appears that it falls somewhere in the middle. It's not purely over here in the commercial side of things. It's not purely over here, obviously, in the residential side of things. It does seem to serve some greater purpose. That's the reason that the institutional use category is a thing, and it's not just this list of uses that we put things in. But again, I would say the staff's recommendation is that we do not set up a one-size-fits-all mandate of this number of parking spaces for a city that is how many square miles? I don't actually know how many square miles.
I know I have 55, 58 of them.
58. Let's pretend that they're all equal size.
They're not.
They're not. We'll round down because yours is large. Let's round it to 40 times 14.
I just got one.
A lot of
60 square miles. It's huge. So the city of Dallas is large. So, and today we have in the zoning code, it does not matter where you are unless you're in the central area. You've got to give me one parking space for every 200 square or 500 square feet of child daycare facility floor space. And we've heard from Mr. Neverez that the number of square feet in your facility, there's no line you can draw to the number of cars that need or don't need to park there. And do we need to provide a parking space for the square footage of the building that has to sit there all day and be empty because no one's there picking up a child because it's 12:30 and not 8 o'clock or 5 o'clock. So right now we have this regime that sets us up to make people build empty parking spaces. And this is an opportunity to allow each individual business to determine their own needs, the same as we allow them to determine how large the building needs to be, how many children they want to provide service to, how many families they want to include. Simply another part of their business equation. It's how many parking spaces do I need to provide for my specific set of clients in my specific location.
That answer your question, Mr. Blair?
Yeah, I do.
Okay, Ms. Bagley?
I think a lot of our concern here, particularly with the residential areas, is that you've already gone through that it's more feasible to just build a new structure and then to try to retrofit a house to work. So you've got this row of houses and you've got a lot. They tear the house down. By right, they can build a child care, whatever name you want to give it here. That's going to be an anomaly essentially in the middle of the block. And that, unless they've got some sort of deed restriction somewhere on what it has to look like. So you got this, I just remember the whole chain of, there were whole chains of childcare when my kids were little, and that's a long time ago. But I think you got this structure that's gonna stand out like a sore thumb to some people. Some people will be very happy about it. That, to me, if it's in that residential district, it ought to have this same number of parking places as the other residences do, because it's a hybrid use sort of in there, and I don't know how many of those do we have, but I think that's the concern, is that we create every 1,000 feet or next to each other these uses or buildings that don't fit in the neighborhood. I do not want to overpark the world. I've been anti-parking expansion for years, but I just think it has to consider it. I don't have any problem with all the requirements in the commercial districts or the industrial commercial other district. It just concerns me that we are bringing a business into the middle of a neighborhood, because this becomes much more business than what's allowed by right already. So I think it's just concerns me that you don't have enough parking. I think and you're always going to have traffic in a neighborhood. If it's a neighborhood where you have small houses and you've got one driveway with one garage, and now you have 4 kids living there that all have cars. I mean, you're going to have that kind of situation. But I just think the caution is in, if you're going to allow it by right, then it ought to conform to the zoning requirement for parking of the district that it's in.
I would mention that, so in this proposal, we did respond to ZOAC's discussion, and we've included it's written as exemption, but currently institutional use is allowed unlimited height and up to 60% lot coverage in residential districts. And we have included language that would require that the child care facility meet the same setbacks, same height requirements as the home. We don't have, and lot coverage, and we're not allowed by the state to regulate materials anymore. If there is an NSO in the property, that if the neighborhood has determined that character is important enough, they've created a conservation district or an NSO, then it's going to have to meet the NSO requirements. If it's in a conservation district, it may or may not be, depending on how it's written, even permitted to be used as a daycare, child care facility, and it's still, no matter what, going to have to meet the conservation district standards. So in terms of, and someone, if there's no NSO, no conservation district in a residential neighborhood, today someone could come and knock down a particular style of home and build, and we've seen it in Elm Thicket, right? If there's no other form of character or aesthetic control in the neighborhood, most areas in Dallas are just base zone. I say that broadly. Many of what we consider to be neighborhoods in Dallas are base zone. Those kind of character things, aesthetic things, are changeable today. And we do understand, of course, that it is different. It's not a home, it's a commercial structure. And if the body feels that matching those parking requirements is that important, then certainly, that's your vote to make.
Ms. Bagley, does that respond to your question?
Yeah.
So, Mr. Hall, before we go to second round, members online, are there other questions?
I have some.
Commissioner Carpenter?
Yes, to carry on in the same vein as Ms. Bagley, not only is there the potential here, if you allow them by right in residential areas to, knock down one house and put in a commercial structure, but because of the platting, institutional uses are not held to the pattern of the residential area. So someone could conceivably buy multiple lots, and you could have house, and then maybe 3 or 4 lots that used to have houses that were torn down, and you have a commercial structure, and then you have, house again. So there's a potential here for very radically changing the character of the neighborhood by the rules for institutional uses. Now, I do appreciate the fact that you did alter the proposed regulations for the height and the lot coverage, but have you given any real consideration to the sort of the disproportionate impact that this could have by right in these residential neighborhoods?
Sure. So I'm actually looking up right now. I'm not sure if where the institutional exemption from the existing lot pattern for replats is. I don't know if that's in.
We see it in every single plat case that comes to CPC.
Sure, and I know what section you're talking about. I don't know if that institutional exemption is in the subdivision ordinance, which we can't touch here, or if it's in the zoning ordinance. We potentially could. I'm not sure. So that's something that I'll try to find. But no, we haven't considered that piece yet. But we did, in talking about the lot coverage and those pieces, we did add those items in.
Moving on to parking, I really don't understand the staff's reluctance to require 1 or 2 parking spaces in a residential area. I cannot imagine a daycare facility of any sort that would not have to have a parking space, because if people are coming in bringing infants, multiple children, or an adult that has, cognitive or mobility issues, parking on the street, taking a bus or something is not really a possibility. So it just seems to me almost that theory is outweighing practicality here. So are you really envisioning a daycare center that has no parking spaces, that asking them to provide 1 or 2 parking spaces would be a deal killer?
I don't see that as being a deal killer. What I see is removing the city from imposing that requirement that may or may not be best for that particular business in that particular location. I understand, of course, we've done it citywide for 60 years at least, 120 years, probably 80 years. My math is very bad when it comes to years. 10 years ago, it was still 1990. That's what we all know. I would say that we fully understand that this has been the way that we have done things, but for 80 years. However, that is not to say that it is the only way or the most appropriate way. And in my estimation, the most appropriate way is to remove myself, because I don't know how many spaces that use needs. And we've heard from transportation experts, many transportation experts, that their professional understanding is that the numbers that we require for parking are based on what we observed for parking, not what is actually needed. So we looked at something, we said, that's what they're doing, let's pick a number that's in that range and say you have to do it. And no, I don't think it's going to be a deal killer. I think that if we say the minimum is 0, I think that each individual business will be able to determine their needs, just as they do with how many children they want to provide care to, how many chickens in the bucket, how they get to determine a whole host of other things that fit their business best. And in my opinion, we should be allowing them to do the same with parking. If they determine the need to have 2 parking spaces, we're not saying they can't have them. We're just saying we're not going to make you do what you don't need to do. And again, there's never with the lot coverage requirements and all of those and the setbacks and all of those items that are going to otherwise limit the size and coverage of their building. If they have no parking today and in 2 years they determine, hey, we really need 2 parking spaces for drop-offs, or maybe we only need 1 parking space for drop-off because that's just the way that we've worked our timing out. They can come in and get I don't even know if they get a flat work permit, update their site plan, or if they need one, and meet their need when they need to meet it, not because Steven said so.
And I think, it would be a win if the parking requirement changed to 1 or 2. I don't think that's what we're trying to say, but it's, once we drop, and we say, yes, 1 or 2, that is the correct number of spaces, we lose that piece of conversation throughout the public hearing process.
I understand what you're saying. Yes, right now, I understand where the traffic engineers are because the requirements are a fixed number of spaces per square footage of the facility. Okay, that's one extreme, but it seems to me 0 is, we flip-flop to the other extreme. I don't see that 1 or 2 is particularly onerous, but I'll let that go. I do have a couple of other questions. Because my most fundamental problem with this is I'm inferring that the staff thinks that there's going to be a whole new wonderful world of affordable daycare if this SUP provision is dropped. And I know District 6 was called out as having the fewest number of licensed daycare facilities. I think that's because District 6 is very heavily working class people and daycare is very expensive. And I don't think that the SUP requirement, yes, I will say it's an extra expense, but it's not an expense compared to the cost of construction, borrowing money, renovations, insurance, staff salaries, staff benefits, everything that you have to do with daycare. So I think one of the reasons why these licensed facilities don't exist in places like District 6 is there's a finite number of people who can afford to pay those kinds of fees. And we have lots and lots of what I'll call friends and family daycare, where nobody's cheaper than grandma, other than one of your partners. So I guess I'll just my question is: are you really thinking that removing this SUP requirement is going to make daycare more available because it's all of a sudden drastically less expensive?
I would say that it's probably not going to make much of a difference. I hope it makes a great deal of a difference, but all the other regulatory barriers that childcare facilities have, it's a lot of effort on a business owner to open one of these. Not to mention the need that we're going to have for adult daycare facilities as, the largest part of our population demographic ages, So it's not, like zoning, we don't really get to do a whole lot for the economy, but if we can remove one barrier to make it less difficult, I think it would help. It's not going to solve all of our problems, but I think it would help.
Yeah, I have no quarrel with removing the SUP requirement for most of these districts, but I'm just not there with removing the SUP requirement for residential neighborhoods. I see just too much possibility for disruption, but that's enough for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter. Any other comments before we go to second round for discussion? Mr. Hall?
2 things. One is the parking. It seems to me with daycare, you have cars coming in the morning and you have cars coming in the evening, but the rest of the day they're not there. And I know in our neighborhood, what we really run into is construction, where there's far more construction vehicles and cars and things like that blocking the streets for 10 hours a day, So, and residents are parking on the streets. They're not using garages. So,
they're using garages.
Yeah, and you can't control the number of cars that a person owns, and so they're parking them on the street. So there's, that kind of thing. I don't know. It's always going to be an issue. But I can't see the drop off at 9, pick up at 5 it's nearly as big an issue as all day construction for months at a time and neighbors using the streets as their garage. Second, it also seems to me that the problem is really one of legality versus illegality. If somebody's going to fight the regulations and costs to build one of these things, they're going to be a responsible owner, I would think. They're not going to do it on a whim. But it's the people who are not doing it legally that are just, opening the daycare in their home without. I mean, it sort of gets back to almost like the short-term rental thing. It's an issue of enforcement. You have legal businesses and you have illegal businesses, and how do you enforce that? How do you regulate that? So, I'm not asking a question. I'm just making a statement. To me, it's just. I think it's an honorable thing to try to offer more daycare. Society needs that. The city needs that. The neighborhoods need that. And however we can do it, I think we should do it. But we're always going to run into the problem of people not following the rules and causing a lot of problems.
And I would say that we did reach out to code compliance and said, hey, do you have any, problems with daycares? And they're like, no. Like, they laughed at us for asking them if they have problems. They're like, no, not at all. They did do a search, just to try to find, if they could find any instances out of like the millions and millions of complaints that they received. And they did receive some for dog daycares. And that was the most, complained thing for doggy, illegal dog daycare.
And that is not included in this.
Yes, that is not.
Thank you for the clarification, Mr. Goff.
But they said that has not been one of their, soft enforcement problems. Daycares has not been a problem for them. So.
Yeah, I sort of feel from a market perspective, market forces are going to drive the legal aspect of this thing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, as a parent, I'm not going to want to send my child to a place without a license,
But that's not the case for everyone,
True.
The cost will be an issue and availability and things like that. So.
And if you think about the market forces driving that, not having a choice will put desperate parents to put their children in some less secure places. And that's the real tragedy here that we need to recognize, is that when there is no choice, our youngest and most vulnerable population of the city are put in dangerous places. That's what we want to help address. We're making it more,
Thank you, Ms.
available.
May.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. Mr. Reeves.
Thank you. A couple of comments here. Really good discussion. Really appreciate just kind of sitting back and listening. To Commissioner Carpenter, the platting, that's on the base zoning. So they would not, if someone we're trying to replat 3 lots in the middle of a single family neighborhood, that would not be allowed because it would not meet the space size requirements. It wouldn't, because it wouldn't be based on the use, it would be on the underlying zoning, wouldn't it?
Institutional uses are exceptions. Just like churches and schools, this is an institutional use.
So, okay, then that would be a hole here. Then I would agree with you. If someone was coming mid-block and wiping out 3 houses and whatnot, and because it's an institutional use, they could do whatever they were going to do then. Okay, then the platting would not hold up. Okay, glad I asked that question. Second thing is that, currently about parking really quick, we're looking at, currently it's 1 to 500. And I will agree with Miss May, if you had a 3,000 square foot home that you were going to convert, that would require 6 parking spaces in the current code. And we were talking about knocking it down to 1 based on if it was single family, for example. that's a win. I don't care how you look at it. That my other kind of pet peeve is the phrase, we'll let the market decide. If we let the market decide, I would have seen many a neighborhoods ruined if we let the market decide. And I think maybe in this case, we can possibly let the market more reside. But the reason we have zoning is that we're not the wild, wild, wild west. You know, it's a fair boundary that we can all play by. We cannot just say, you know, Mark Cuban can build whatever he wants because he has the money to do it because the market will decide. I mean, like, so that's kind of my pet peeve. Another pet peeve is enforcement. Texas has an open container law, but people walk their dogs in my neighborhood all the time with a drink because they're not bothering anybody. They're not being jerks. They're not peeing on someone's front yard. But if they are a jerk, and the police don't care if you're not a jerk, but if you're a jerk, there's a rule to enforce. So with the different rules, like the 12 or fewer is allowed by right. How are we going to enforce 12? I don't think that's something you proactively enforce. If someone is obviously abusing that privilege, then you have a rule that you can go do something about it. You're not supposed to have more than how many related family members in a house? Is it 3, 4? Anybody? I mean, we don't proactively enforce that either. But if somebody is obviously running a hostel and, you know, they've got 18 construction trucks all up and down and they built little cabins in the back, which I've heard happens in many districts, so they've got multiple 8x12 units, then there is a law that we can indeed shut them down. But honestly, if they're behaving themselves, they're okay. Let's use accessory dwelling units. If I could hit a golf ball straight, I could stand on my rooftop and I could hit 6 rental units in people's backyards in my neighborhood. That's illegal, but nobody cares because they're not being jerks. But if somebody wanted to be a jerk about it, then we would enforce that. So there's proactive enforcement, and then there's but there's something to be able to say, no, you know, you're having parties all night long. You've got 18 people living in this back house. That is an illegal land use. We can the city has something to shut it down. But the 6 that are surrounding me are all single family. I mean, a single family, small family, residential. They're living in a 600 or 700 square foot. Nobody cares. So rules are there to be enforced sometimes when you're a jerk and you want to break those rules. So the fact that there's, you know, 12 or fewer or something like that doesn't bother me a bit, because the rule would be there. And just like the parking, 1 parking space, give me a break. When we were saying 1 per 500, 1 to get somebody off the street or to park because I'm pulling in the driveway to help my mother or my child and I'm dropping them off and I'm leaving. That is not a big deal breaker here. So it just seems kind of like no brainer to me. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves.
I would chime in for the sake of the city attorney's office that we strive to enforce all of our ordinances equally without respect to anything.
Thank you, staff and city attorney, for that clarification. We appreciate that. I wanted to follow up on a couple of questions from the discussion. First item is on this question of lot size and platting. Within 51A 4.404, we have minimum lot area for residential use. I don't see that we have the corresponding maximum, but within that section, it says a person shall not reduce a lot below the minimum area requirements of this section unless, and then there's an exception for local government agencies, community unit development. Would that be an appropriate consideration to consider with this use to help speak to this idea of conforming any future development to the existing, you know, size, lot, and character?
So I think that the question is less of do they have to comply with the minimums? They do. The question is, do we want to place a maximum? I don't think so. I think the issue at hand is the institutional uses are not held to the conformity, the lot size and for me, and I don't know where that provision is. I can't find where institutional uses are exempted from that plating standard. That's what I've been trying to find, and I don't really know where it is.
I have to look for one again.
Yeah, so
But I assumed it's in Article 8.
I believe it's under institutional uses, so that's something that we may need to get confirmed. I think you're hearing there's a few. I think that would be an important item to be addressed based on comments that I've heard in today's discussion. Second item I wanted to talk about is this idea of spacing. I think what I heard in the discussion on spacing had to do with intensity of the use overwhelming an area, and whether that was through a spacing, whether it was through a size. I think if I understand staff's approach, the size of the development is addressed through tying it back to the allowed development footprint. I'm R75A, I get X lot coverage, I get X setbacks, 36 feet in height, 30 feet in height, I believe. All those requirements. Was there any consideration giving, similar to what we do in some other uses where we say you can't be more than 3,500 square feet? That there's an actual cap on the size of what the unit, I guess, is in staff's review. I tried to go back through a few of the cases that I'm familiar with on how big the developments are. I mean, they've been 2,000 square feet. I think I had one that was 4,900 going into an existing building. Was there any consideration of what the average of these might be that might give us something to consider? Because again, it's everything from it goes to a school, it's part of a church, it's within a multifamily project. So there really is no kind of reference size that might be an appropriate consideration.
That's correct. And in our research of the SUPs and talking to case planners, if it was an SUP that had a maximum square footage, that came from the applicant who said, I'm planning to build a 4,223 square foot building. And then we just put that as the maximum. So.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Doss. And then final question on the hours that are included. I'm going from memory here, but I believe it was 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. What was was that a reference from somewhere? Or is that just based on how daycares typically are operating in the city currently?
We just matched it to the existing prohibition on outdoor activities for day homes.
Okay. So that comes back to essentially a current standard that we have. Okay. And then one other question, I guess, on the spacing. I was trying to go back through and do some quick research, refresh my memory. 1,000 feet, I know we use 1,500, we use 1,200. Is it correct that kind of an average for, I'm going to say, walkability standard would be a quarter mile? Is that a known metric that folks use?
So a quarter mile is typically the distance that someone is willing to walk without driving their car.
And how many feet is that?
1,320.
Thank you. So again, that kind of quarter mile reference is something that we use in everything from measuring walkability to how we think about spaces in between uses. And I tried to do some quick research, and as Ms. May said, block widths are all over the map, everywhere in the United States and in Dallas as well. But I mean, again, that kind of, I think the notes I saw is that it's typically between 200 and 600 feet. So if it was 1,000-foot spacing was considered, that would typically mean one every 2 blocks. I mean, just again, it can vary based on what the character is, or how the neighborhood developed, community developed, downtown developed. And actually, do we know what our downtown block standard is? Is it a quarter mile?
Tanner,
It needs to be 1,000.
Yeah. Thank you.
1,000 feet was traditional in
Block size,
block
downtown.
length. Yeah.
So I was just trying to get some metric, and Mr. Hawkins, it's a good point. What does that really translate to? How do we think about that? So my other question, I guess, I was trying to go back through, we've got proposed amendments before us in our case report. They start on page 13. I think we have 3 boxes in what's before us today. Is that correct? Okay. And so I guess Oh, I did have one other question. Under the maximum building height, where staff has added the, essentially that a child care or adult care facility is limited to the applicable height in each district. Would that be clearer if it was simply in the special height provisions, item 1, that under institutional uses except childcare and adult daycare? Simply removing it from the institutional uses as a new section, or does that just? It's just a question on formatting, and that may be a city attorney question on where's the clearest place to put that.
Oh, I see.
Well, I think it's because in the height provisions, there are 4 existing exceptions. So it's not just except for.
Understood, yeah. I'm just asking if that would be another approach, if that provided any more clarity. I'm content to leave it where it is. I just wanted to ask the question as we're trying to think about what this is. To consider the. Mr. Hall?
Does a church by right have the right to come into a residential neighborhood and buy up 3 or 4 lots and build a church?
Yes.
Okay, so that can be done. And then they can have daycares or whatever they want to do and put in 100 parking spaces or whatever. Okay, how often is that done? Anybody have a clue?
It was done a lot in as these churches grew, the mega churches and things like that.
But until they are forced to move from the residential into their own space, and after he's done, I was like.
Yeah. Now, I realize these aren't businesses, but they're operating like a business in the sense that they're buying real estate and building a structure. So I have a feeling that's going to be more common than daycares coming in and buying up 3 or 4. It's just my thought. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hall. I saw Vice Chair Blair and then Ms. Bagley.
I have no real issue with daycares and commercial and CS and industrial. My
I can't hear anybody. Can y'all?
I can't hear anything, no.
Hey, there are those in downtown Dallas. If you can hear us, we cannot hear you.
Right, or see you.
Or see.
Lost you on our main display, so we're reconnecting virtually, so.
Okay, we can hear you now.
In a brief recess at 10:18, we should be back as soon as we get Wi-Fi back.
You're cutting it out. We can
Please
hear about
stand
every third word. I
by.
think I heard recess, but that's about it.
And I think we have just restarted.
Okay.
And we are back. Recording is resumed, so it's 10:19 a.m. So thank you all. So Vice Chair Blair.
Okay, so my concern is the connotation and the belief that daycares are in residential, especially in a working class neighborhood, is something staff is not familiar with. I don't think you guys are familiar with the way daycares work in a working class neighborhood. Especially when you in a working class neighborhood, you'll have a church that a house has been changed into a church and it's got a daycare in it. And then it becomes a heat spot because they take out the grass and they put in concrete for your child, and to unregulate those that are operating legally. And then you have a whole plethora of daycares that don't go through the standard that and if you unregulate the use and say it's okay, anybody can do a daycare in residential in a community that is more apt to follow the law, opposed to those that do it for different reason. I see this as just as a community that looks at home, what are they called? The handicapped dwelling, and they look at it the same way. They look at daycares and they look at handicap, and they don't look at them as a institutional benefit in their community. They look at it as an institutional detriment, because it does bring what staff is missing when it comes down, whether it's at 5 or 7, 6 or 7. I just got back up. It brings about a lot of traffic the residential communities don't want. I worked in a daycare right before becoming a commissioner. It was the most god-awful experience I've ever had in my life. I love children, as long as they don't belong to me. And I worked in a daycare in a church. And even in a church, the intensity of the traffic when it was time to drop them off and pick them up, and no, you never had a time of day that it got to the point you had to limit the time that the parents could drop off their kids. After 10 o'clock, you couldn't drop them off, because otherwise you had traffic going all day and someone coming and going all day and all night, all day until they open and close. And then when you pick them up, you have to limit when they could be picked up for the same reasons. I passed a case that we did a daycare on a corner of residential, and the community, I had to finesse them. It was a needed, they agreed it was needed, but one of the things they said, we don't want the traffic in our residential neighborhood. And it was a brand new daycare, and we had to replat it. And I still, every now and then, get a phone call from a resident that says, why did you pass this? And why are you now making us have to deal with this intensity of the traffic in our residential community? They are not going to come down here and speak, but they're going to fuss and complain to me. My church, we put in a daycare and we passed it, but I belong to a mega church. And that mega church has the parking, has the all of the things, and it was and the residents and everyone around thought it was the appropriate place for the daycare to go, because it wasn't in residential, but it was close enough to residential that it was the residents who are there. And no, I have yet to find one resident who will walk to pick up their kid, they drive. They drive through, drop them off, especially in inclement weather or hot weather. The daycare, the church that I worked at was in residential, across from a mega church, and within walking distance to single-family homes and multifamily homes. Those residents did not walk to drop their kids off. They would drive, drop them off, drive back home. Drive, pick them up, drive back home. Yep. So the fallacy of the writings of beliefs are detrimental to the health and the health of a single family residential community that wants to stay single family and residential. The park, from parking to all of this, they want to be able to regulate what it is that is allowed in their residential neighborhoods. And the only way I see to do that is with the SUP and residential. So I can see it, even in multifamily, yeah, I can see it. It's a little difficult, it's a little stretch, but I can still see that because in multifamily, you have parking that is already associated with the needs of the multifamily. Mixed use, wonderful. It would be wonderful to have a daycare right where you live, and that I believe is what staff sees, and in what you're trying to do in residential. I see it in mixed use would work wonderfully. My question is, did you look at any residential neighborhoods? Did you physically look at any residential neighborhoods to see a daycare actually working in a single family where traffic is coming, like a typical traffic study that says, this is what it looks like, this is how it impacts a residential community between the hours of 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. and the hours of 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. Have you guys ever actually sat and looked in a working class neighborhood that actually has that working?
I know that when we had David Navarez on here earlier, he had talked about looking at traffic patterns of child care facilities and how they're not the same as public and private schools. Is there traffic generation?
No, I'm asking, have you looked at single family residential with a daycare in mid-block, traffic coming in from the hours of 6 a.m. to 9, 4 to 7?
Have we lost Mr.
I-
Navarez?
It's probably more appropriate to ask our traffic engineer that. But anecdotally,
I have not, but my recommendation is not based on traffic exists. Traffic gets bad everywhere. It gets bad at certain times everywhere, whether it's school, whether it's church, whether it's Walmart, whether it's Starbucks. My recommendation is not based on traffic. My recommendation is based on removing a barrier to this use. If there are enforcement issues with queuing into the right of way, that's illegal for anybody. If cars park on the street and they park too far and they're in the travel lane, and that means someone can't get through, that's illegal outside of zoning. And that's an enforcement issue outside of zoning. And unfortunately, CPC, PUD, we don't enforce things. We create the regulations, and code compliance enforces them for us because we don't have the expertise, the knowledge, the ability, the staff to go out and enforce our own codes. And I don't think that's going to change. Have I gone out and sat and watched one of these daycares work? No. I fully admit that freely. But again, my recommendation is not, my recommendation for no parking, my recommendation for location is not based on traffic.
And I understand, daycares can be, there's a wide range of daycares, my experiences with daycares may not be, Vice Chair Blair's experience with daycares. There's a whole spectrum of daycares and how they operate. My experience with daycares is that parents are told when they can drop off their children and when they cannot. And it's so they can make sure that the appropriate staff are there, that they have the facilities for drop off, and there's a whole mixed and lots of variables that determine traffic patterns and when parents drop off and pick up. And it's just, it's hard to make those lines in a zoning ordinance, and we just don't think it belongs in zoning.
Thank you, Ms. May. Thank you, Mr. Goss. Ms. Bagley? All right. So I'm gonna go back to where Mr. McGregor, I was gonna start having us look at proposed amendments. Did you have additional questions for staff?
I'm good.
Okay. So I'm
Ready.
Mr. Reeves, I think I see one more hand.
Yes. Question, and this is just something in our document. On page 15, at the top, the ZOAC request B, we say the last paragraph says when located in all those districts within 1,000 feet, blah, blah, blah. It's by right if 12 or fewer attendees. Do we also need to add that if it's 13 or more, it needs an SUP? Because it's not clear there.
That's one that's written.
Yes, if the 12 or fewer by right within 1,000 feet and SUP if more than 12, yes.
Right,
we would.
because the way it's worded right now, by leaving that out, would be that it would not be allowed at all if it was more than 13. Is that correct?
Well, no, actually, the way it's written now, it would be not permitted at all if you have more than 12, if you're in one of those districts. So
Okay.
you are
So-
correct. You would want to add in that SUP.
Okay, because I think that was what we originally wanted, but I don't want to speak for everybody, but I was thinking it would be like 13 or more with SUP. But anyway, that was just a clarification question. Thank you.
Catch.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. So I'm gonna start at the top and see if we can walk through these. So I'm on page 13 of our case report, proposed amendments. And the first question is combining child or adult daycare facility as one use. It's adjusted the age. They brought some other language forward to match current standards. Is there any other discussion? And this is before we get to page 14 where we have districts where permitted. This is just the definition.
So the number 3 before you get to staff recommendation.
Correct.
So it's on page 13, number 3 at the bottom to 14 above staff recommendation.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Any discussion? Is that? Okay.
Good with that.
I'm seeing none. So that gets us to the first question, which has been a lot of our discussion today, which is districts permitted. And so we've got 3 boxes. We have a staff recommendation box, and then we have a ZOAC A and a ZOAC B. We have the clarification just made by Mr. Reeves on B.
B.
So I'm going to open it up for discussion.
And I'm asking what kind of discussion are we looking for?
Is there a consensus? Do we?
Which one do you want?
Which one do you like? Okay.
Yeah.
Does that something, just is maybe possibly something you're asking each one of us?
Well, other than Mr. Reeves' clarification, is there anything else we would want to see changed? Is there any other information from staff?
Just a question.
Yes, Ms. Bagley.
He said earlier that because you can't really identify the numbers if they're more than 12 or less, that's going to be hard to enforce. Just a clarification.
Is that correct,
That's-
Mr. Dawes?
Yes.
So staff is concerned that on ZOAC B, by including the number of attendees, that there's a potential enforcement
Yes.
challenge.
And
And
so-
for those
so-
online, we're hearing a yes to that question.
I have a
So-
question.
wait a minute.
But stand by, Commissioner Carpenter, Vice Chair Blair.
I just need you to restate and re-clarify what you're saying for B. I think I missed something, so I just need to get it, I just need to be at the same place you are.
The clarification from Mr. Reeves.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes,
And the number of attendees.
okay.
So I'll start at attendees. Just from a pure, how do we actually know and manage and enforce a maximum number of attendees? No idea. And if I tell code compliance, hey, you've got to do this now, and I tell building inspection, they've got to tell you how many on their CO, building inspection is going to say, okay, they can say 12. I'm never going to know. So enforcement for a number of attendees is, I don't want to use the word impossible because anything is possible, but very difficult. The clarification from Mr. Reeves was that, and I'll just tell you what I typed in as my red line. So on ZOAC requested B on page 15. Yeah, that's a good idea. We have technology here. This one. And we will zoom way in.
Oh, so you're gonna show us live?
I'm just going to show you live.
Yeah,
We're going
uh-huh.
back to the single housing. That's CPC.
Yeah, make it big, so blind eyes
It's
can
on
see.
a delay. I'm going as big as I can.
So old blind eyes can see, right?
Okay, so
Just because I need to.
Oh, and then here someone is bringing technology right to my face.
So, and Mr. Reeves, you take a look at this, but I think this is what you're discussing is that we had left a gap by which, if B had been passed as written in black, then there was this gap of if you had more than 13 in a residential district, there was not even an SUP you could get. You were just not allowed. So we added in this red, so where if you're within 1,000 feet, if you're in one of those districts and you have fewer than 12 or fewer by right, but more than 13 or more, then you have to get an SUP just like today. So we're adding in that 12. Again, staff does not recommend B at all because enforcement will be just basically
Well,
not a point because it's not going to be able to be adequately enforced. So there's that. But that's what that's the clarification for B.
I had a question about that. Just to clear.
Yes, Ms. May.
Okay. So this comes from our previous meeting, basically, I'm just trying to seek clarification on. But so in that underlined portion before the red, so if you're like in these lower density residential districts and you're within 1,000 feet, if you have 12 or fewer, it's by right, or was the intention that if you no matter how many people you have, if you're within 1,000 feet, you have an SUP. Does that make sense? So this is saying because it says within 1,000 feet by right.
So, and members, my recollection of the discussion was there was a spacing requirement, but if you were less than 12, it was still a spacing requirement, but it was a way to manage essentially the size of what the use could be. And then the current discussion is we've got a gap because as written, if you were at 13, you would suddenly be prohibited. And so I think Ms. May's question was the intent to have both a spacing and an attendance cap for the by right? And I'll kind of stop there to see if there's some nodding or if there's further clarification. That's what I think I had heard from the last discussion. And then what we would be adding in the red text is that if you're over 1,000 and 13, it's SUP. So you've still got the spacing requirement added, but then it generally maintains current with an SUP. I think one question I'll ask back to the group from today's discussion is, this includes not only single family, but also duplex, townhouse, cluster housing, and manufactured home. So are those all? Where is multifamily in this? Within
Multifamily
ours.
is residential above.
Got it.
So,
Thank you. I'm just used to seeing that broken out.
yeah, you know,
So, and I
Lake
guess
Waters.
that is
we have
a,
to write it.
I think what we meant to say in the underline was by SUP instead of by right in that black.
No,
When it was
no,
12 or more.
12 or less was
Full
by
view
right.
Yeah.
Well, it was within
But
1,000 feet.
So you had to be, you couldn't be within 1,000 feet with more than, no, or
No, she's just saying that the way that is written, it could be within 1,000 feet.
Right.
Without having an
SUP. So you can be within 1,000,
Opposite of what we said you had to be.
Right, right.
one before. And
Yeah,
so in 14,
yeah. I think I would do 13 or more by SUP is how I would reword that.
so we confused ourselves completely.
Like instead of adding that one, I would just, I mean, you can leave it there for now.
So numbers online, you're back to being small, so feel free to jump in.
Or more by SUP.
Yeah, B should be A, it's just that it includes.
Then you can't do.
Yeah.
Commissioner Carpenter, were you trying to make a comment?
Yes, I was. Could you show me the staff recommendation on the screen?
This is.
Yeah. I mean, personally, I think we're kind of getting off into the weeds a little bit with the number of children that can be taken care of and the spacing. My suggestion would just be districts permitted by right in retail, central area, mixed use, multiple commercial, office and urban corridor districts by SUP and residential, CS and industrial districts. To me, that's the most elegant solution. We have by right options already in single family residential neighborhoods. They're the day homes and they're the daycares that are affiliated with churches and with schools. And to me, that would be preferable to adding in the distancing and the attendee limitations.
And Commissioner Carpenter, did you intend to consider multifamily and single family in the same way?
No,
So
no, I did not. No, multifamily, it could be by right, sorry. By right in multifamily residential, however it needs to be worded, but to make it clear that single family residential and whatever the other districts are, it would be SUP.
So I'm going to try to restate this and everyone correct me if
Thank you.
So under staff recommendation, it would be by right in multifamily residential, retail, central area, mixed use, multiple commercial, office, and urban corridor, and is by SUP districts, period. By SUP in single family residential, CS and industrial districts. And I'll let the city attorneys tell me if I use the correct terminology on those two.
Okay, so say it again, by SUP in CS and industrial
And single family residential.
and
So that would be the R districts.
single family residential districts. That's staff's recommendation.
Well, that is not staff. That is
That's our
discussion that Commissioner Carpenter has brought forward for our discussion. So remove the 1,000-foot spacing, remove the discussion of so spacing is in ZOAC A, spacing and number of attendees is in ZOAC B. It would remove both of those and simply define where it's allowed by right, where it's allowed by SUP.
Madam Chair,
Mr. McGregor.
thank you. I just want to make sure that I'm
that's the
I'm not
best.
making comments throughout this, but I want to make sure that the fact that I'm silent does not mean that I agree. I just, I want to say that.
Understood. We're trying to make sure it's clear for everyone.
Yeah, no, sure. So I'm looking at what you guys are doing. I'll say for now that I think that all the 4 boxes now, I think they are all too restrictive, but I'll save my logic and rationale for when the time for comments come. For now, I just wanted to say I'm following what you guys are doing. I just don't want to be thought of agreeing just because I'm not commenting.
Understood, and thank you, Mr. Gregor, but again, so we are now at 4 boxes, if you will, so sort of a modified
Wait a minute,
staff,
go
which
back.
is ZOAC C.
EPC.
Go back.
Yes.
So what you're saying in ZOAC C, from what was said, the multifamily, residential, retail, that's all 5 by SUP and CS industrial. That's what we said, that's what she said, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just, instead of saying single family residential, it's residential except for multifamily. Okay. So if we want to come back to districts, I'm fine. I think our other 2 boxes are parking and Board of Adjustment. I will say, I'm going to ask one final question that's in the same vein. We have accessory uses where a day home is allowed by right. This is on page 16 of our case report. Did staff give consideration to allowing the child care or adult care facility where incidental to a primary institutional use by right? I think that may be covered in what staff has in their recommendation.
Right, so childcare, when it is operated by a church, and I think there's like 4 things that's in the case report that it has to do. Operated by the church, everybody's an employee of the church, and the church is responsible for all the operations.
So that's already allowed.
That's already allowed by right.
And that's by the determination that, and that's not in code, that is the determination by the building official that that daycare use is customarily incidental to the religious organization.
And
There's this weird
some
institutional.
supporting evidence.
Yeah, there's a little bit in the code about, if the educational facility is integral to and inseparable from its sponsoring religious organization, and then there's some weird stuff. But this is only 2 hours max today. There's some evidence in the code that supports a religious organization sponsored daycare as being not what we consider to be a daycare.
Okay, and again, I just wanted to make sure, was there any other consideration there? Okay, so I think we've covered accessory uses, we've covered districts. I think our other 2 questions that are before us today are regarding parking. We have a staff recommendation, we have a ZOAC request, and then similar on Board of Adjustment. So I'm going to go to any questions on parking, off-street parking. Okay, I'm seeing none, so we'll need to make a determination on that. Any questions or discussion on the Board of Adjustment? So, well, it technically starts on page 15. The bulk of it's actually on page 16. There's 2 boxes. There's a staff recommendation, and then there's the ZOAC request. Ms. Bagley.
The ZOAC request gives a lot of parameters for the Board of Adjustment, and I think they need it because they're in la la land up here. There's too much discretionary in the staff's recommendation for the Board of Adjustment. In working with Board of Adjustments as I do, the more guidelines that they have, the easier it is,
Well,
or the better for the applicant.
and I get staff, and I certainly understand providing flexibility, but does it also perhaps give some predictability on what might be considered by having?
I have not worked with the Dallas Board of Adjustments. I've worked with a couple other Board of Adjustments, and while predictability may be a value, it is not a virtue I have seen. But again, I've never worked with the Dallas Board of Adjustments,
Thank you.
regardless of how many guidelines there are.
Yeah.
That's just my personal opinion of other cities.
As a
Exactly.
private side, I went one time. I will hopefully never go again. But I do work in other cities, and where there are other guidelines, additional guidelines, it's a lot easier for the Board of Adjustment. Still unpredictable, but Dallas was weird. I'm sorry.
Nope.
Disrespectful.
Well, I thank you everyone for perspective on that. So any other discussion? Commissioner Carpenter?
Yes, I mean, my personal preference would be that we not include the special exception whatsoever and make them stick with the variance standard. I mean, I think this just has a considerable potential for disruption. This is specifically for single-family neighborhoods, and I don't see that there's going to be a lot of support in single-family neighborhoods for these businesses to plop into the middle of their neighborhood and then also be able to meet a lesser standard for having all the parking or a good deal, however much parking in the front, and also playground structures. I think it just intensifies the potential intrusion of, commercial businesses in the middle of a neighborhood. So, my preference would be that, we not include this special exception whatsoever, but that's just my opinion. I have no problem with people disagreeing with me. So feel free to speak up. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter. So members, I think we're at the point where we need to try to move some of this forward. Does anyone want to make a motion or bring something forward for us to advance this further?
Chair, do we need to vote on the individual recommendations? Is that what you're getting?
Well, yeah, we can either do it as a group or do them individually. And at this point, I think we might need to consider them individually.
I would recommend
Individually,
yes.
Madam Chair, before we do that, can we, so can I just jump in with my general comments? Because I think they affect the way I look at all these individually. And I know people have had a chance to make comments while they ask questions.
We've had a wide-ranging discussion. So yes, Mr. McGregor.
We did.
Please.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I've been quiet because I know there's a lot of us thinking of putting in restrictions, and we are anticipating all the what ifs. What if this could affect the neighborhood this way and that way? And that's what we do, right? We are ZOAC. We look at code. But since our last meeting, I've just kind of tried to process all this, and I took a step back, and I am first looking at the big picture of all this. And to me, there are two overarching considerations as we look at daycares and adult facilities. The first one, it's very, very important. I think it needs to be overstated, really, is that these facilities are not a nuisance. Ms. May answered a question before I asked it when she talked about there's absolutely no indication from 311 calls. I did my own Google research, as unscientific as that is, but I really looked hard for any example, show me sidewalks that are littered with ding dongs and Twinkies, anything to justify the restrictions, right? And there really was nothing. So that's very, very important as we think of all these restrictions. The second one, also very important, is the other side of what happens when you create restrictions for these entities or facilities. And that is that, very compelling on the side of staff adding the report and the summary of information that they included. But the bottom line is that, big picture, we are dealing with child care deserts, not child desert, childcare deserts along the city, and this has an impact both on quality of life to the citizens of Dallas as well as to the economy. I even mean individually with families and the quality of life. How many more women could go back into the workforce? And I think it's fair to say it's by far more women could go into the workforce if they had access to daycare facilities. And there's been discussion about the cost and how expensive they are. Well, the more daycare facilities, the more competition there is, the more likely the cost is to come down. So these to me are two overarching considerations. So I think in general, I would prefer to go much softer on restrictions. I am concerned about, well, I just want to raise a sort of a red flag about the idea of, well, let's put in the restrictions, but we get to do selective code enforcement. I think to me that raises a huge red flag because that implies that somebody gets to determine who's a good operator or a bad operator, who's a jerk and who isn't, right? And while everybody would agree that, say, a party house or the big obvious examples, everybody would agree are disruptive. But then you get into the nuances of, hey, that childcare facility in my neighborhood, they make curry for lunch, and that smell, I don't like the smell of curry. Or, it's run by by this woman that's flirting with my husband, and so I think, so I really want to caution enormously without even going into the more obvious, discrimination for color of skin, for culture, for anything. I caution against selective code enforcement or putting in restrictions knowing that we'll only enforce them when we think it's necessary. Commissioner Carpenter raised a very important point about the ability of these organizations to do replatting and to take 3 homes and turn them into a single facility. And it got me into thinking, well, if it's a child care facility and it's providing the service to the community, how is it different than, say, a church? We don't, it's an inconvenience for me. There's a church on Davis. I won't name it by name, but I go from my house to get to Bishop Arts. I have to drive in front of this church, and they also run a school. It's an inconvenience for me when I want to get to Bishop Arts to eat lunch or have a drink when there's traffic, right? But that's not a reason for that type of institution not to be allowed. In fact, they're not. It's a minor inconvenience. It's outweighed tremendously by the benefit it provides to the community. So the real difference between, say, a church and a childcare is that on paper, one is not for profit and the other one is for profit. But really that only means that one doesn't pay taxes and the other one does on their profit, but they're both essentially run or largely run as businesses, even though one pays taxes and the other one doesn't. So if we allow churches, if we allow schools in residential communities because of the obvious benefit and service that they provide to the community, well, why couldn't we think, what's wrong with thinking of childcare facilities in the same way? I mean, they're providing an important service to communities. So I'm still struggling with that idea and that concern that they would bring replatting, and that replatting would be bad for the community when churches and schools are a good addition to the community. I want to talk about parking and the question of market forces. I know that this idea of market forces gets misread a lot as allowing abusers to decimate communities and neighborhoods and so on. And that's not at all when, as many of you guys know, I've been very, very involved in parking reform over the last, it feels like 10 years, but it's really only 3, I think. And when people talk about allowing the market to do its thing, what it really means is not allowing these decisions to be made in a committee at City Hall so far away from the facts. It's every individual case, every individual potential childcare center has different parking needs, and those are better decided by that entity than by a standard one-size-fits-all in the code. Let me give you an example. The idea of the childcare facilities within small businesses was mentioned before. If we require parking for that facility, that's a very particular case where that's already been parked. The person that's bringing that child in already works at that business and they've already parked their car, and we cannot anticipate that, but we're requiring additional parking for that facility. Like that, there are many, many iterations of different situations where the decision on parking is better made locally. Not requiring parking does not mean encouraging no parking or taking parking away. It only means let the decision be made locally. That's a better place to decide this. Uh, in general, I think that the restrictions that are already in place, they're listed in staff's report by HHS, further in the Dallas Development Code, and in addition, the ones that staff has incorporated into their recommendations related to maximum lot coverage, height, and hours for outdoors activity, they are more than enough. There is one restriction that I still don't understand why we have, because it's not based on anything but us thinking of the what ifs, requiring SUPs on light industrial or CS districts. Whatever. I don't think it should be there, but I can live with it. I'll stop there, but I've been waiting this long to me, this is where I'll be coming from when we come to the final decision. I'm saying this just hopefully to either generate more discussion or help people think a little bit further outside of the box. My last comment is, there's a saying about when you're a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. We are ZOAC. We deal with code, and we're trying to anticipate a lot of things and dealing with them through restrictions. But in fact, there's a much bigger picture, a broader picture that relates to the fact that this is a very soft type of business that does not bring in nuance, and it does have the potential that by reducing restrictions, I'm not sure that I agree with Ms. May when she said by not requiring SPPs that we would see a significant change. I think over time it would be meaningful, but we don't know that either way. But I'll stop there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Members, other discussion? I think Ms. Bagley, you may have been going to take a pass at trying to move us forward.
I'm just going to try to do that.
Okay.
I would like to us to consider this alternate. This is the third alternate C for the districts permitted by right in multifamily, residential, retail, central area, mixed use, multiple commercial, office, urban corridor, and by SUP in CS, industrial, and single family residential.
That's the
So-
new one we just did, right?
Correct.
Mhm.
That's the third.
ZOAC C.
That's ZOAC
As
C.
As
That's Ms.
captured
Carpenter's.
by Mr. Doss on the screen. So members, that's up for discussion to try to begin to move us forward on our proposed amendments. Mr. Reeves.
Yes, I will agree with Ms. Bagley, more by process of elimination with the other one. So if we look at staff's recommendation, I think in all the different cases I've seen down at CPC, I've had like 2 people that downgraded a property. Everybody wants to upzone. And single family is always wanting to be upzoned because it's cheaper than duplex. Single family is cheaper than multifamily. It's cheaper than commercial. So with staff's recommendation to me, it does open up the buying multiple lots in a cheaper, more affordable area by a commercial for-profit business and potentially plopping them down in the middle of a single family neighborhood. And then we have the platting problem. So with the platting issue, with that wide open and the fact that I know it sounds crazy when, the lot across the street just sold for X and I'm just like, holy cow, I can't believe that. But go up the street where the commercial properties are and try to buy those. That dirt's a lot more expensive. So I cannot support staff's recommendation. My personal favorite is ZOAC request B with the limit of 12 and 12 or 13, what we were trying to do that one, but staff seems pretty interested or adamant as does others about getting too much of a nuance and enforcement, whimsical enforcement. And I would say that enforcement is whimsical across the board, but I'm a little bit biased there. So that ends up taking us down to ZOAC C. And to the point about the city not dictating across the whole spectrum, and SUP is locally controlled. So the argument about, oh, we just need to eliminate all this and let the market decide and not let, City Hall determine that. And SUP does give people an option to be able to look at that local, that neighborhood, whatever that they want. And whether it's a 1 year or a 5 year, or whether it's auto renewal, not auto renewal, it does give local control. So I guess by kind of a process of elimination, I agree with ZOAC C.
Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Other discussion?
I'm just writing it down what C is.
Okay.
But I will, what Mr. Reeves just said, I ditto.
Receipt.
I like C. It's cleaner, it's simpler, it is straightforward, and it does still give some parameters in which we need to operate.
Thank you, Vice Chair Blair. Mr. Hall?
This would be, Ms. Bagley's making a motion that we will vote on.
Right. Well, I think we're trying to get to
And so
which,
we will
Did I
vote
hear
on each of these. Okay, thank you.
and I think we have a clarification from Mr. Doss. Yes, Mr.
I just think that process-wise, I think if ZOAC wants to decide what boxes, if whoever wants to make a motion wants to have the discussion now with ZOAC and determine exactly what box, it'll make it easier. So we can say,
right.
If whoever wants to make a motion can say staff recommendation accept for districts permitted, ZOAC C for parking, ZOAC requested. That is going to be simple.
Yeah, understood. So, Mr. Berry?
Yes, could you scroll up just a little bit, please, so I can see A and B?
Yeah, and A and B and staff are all on page, if you have our case report, it's on 14 and 15. I know sometimes it's easier to see them in line.
There's staff in A. If you tell me where to go, and I'll go.
No, I appreciate it.
Just be to parameters around that.
Yeah, I just want to speak to this from a couple different perspectives. I think it's widely quoted that, 50% of small businesses fail in the first 5 years. I have a strong belief in natural selection and the weed out process. And I think I'm hearing a lot of personal anecdotes and just conjecture over what the balance sheet might look like for a childcare facility, for example. I would have loved to have heard from some operators if that's at all appropriate in this kind of issue. I would surmise that the vast majority of expense for a daycare is the staff. I don't think, I don't have this big boogeyman idea that there's going to be some large commercial building. It in particular, if we're talking about the 12 and under children facilities. So with that in mind, I would support option B. I also would support the staff recommendation. I think just 2 more points. As a small business owner, you generally have to comply by all the same regulations as the big guys. So the more we layer on, the more disproportionately it affects the small operations. So I think parsing out the small operations from the larger ones when we can do it in general is helpful in lowering the barriers to what is already a steep number of expenses and regulations. So staff recommendations, I would support in that respect. Also, I'm personally a foster parent, and while that is not subject to as many regulations as running a childcare facility. I can tell you I have some awareness of at the state level how much a childcare facility, certainly a foster care facility, goes through at the state level as operational expenses. So hearing in the beginning of the staff report that we're only supplying need to 37% of children in Dallas, you know, I think we've got to do what we can, because there are many other operating expenses and regulatory expenses, in particular for the smaller operations, again, that disproportionately kind of are a larger percentage of their balance sheet. So I'd be supportive of either staff or option B. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baring. And so when you're saying option B, you're ZOAC, option B
Yep.
with both the attendance number and the spacing, is that correct? I just want to make sure we're using the same terminology.
I think he
Yes,
means
not option B, but correct.
staff recommendation B. The original paragraph, is that what he's saying?
I think he said
Oh.
two things, that's why I'm asking.
Yeah.
But, Mr. Baring, can you just restate?
Yes, I would primarily be supportive of staff recommendation. I could get to supporting, let me read through A again, I apologize.
No. And again, we just want to make sure we heard your comments correctly. I think everybody's trying to listen.
Yeah, I think A and B are fair compromises. I think C goes too far. Again, again, owning a small business, being somewhat involved in this world of childcare, there's a lot of operational procedures and expenses that go into these things. And so I think if we can lift a barrier for the smaller operations, that's helpful.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Baring. So, Mr. Hall or Mr. McGregor, any?
I'm asking you a process question for you.
Vice Chair Bull?
For you, a process question, or for anybody, I guess I should say. How, because we all have a varying idea as to what it is we think should be moved forward. How do we fairly, do we go through and say, okay, do we vote for staff's recommendation? How many is for? How many is against? Okay, then do we do A? And okay, then we do B, and then we do C. How do you propose that we ferret this out so that we all can get to
Well, I think
I made a
again,
motion.
okay.
We're right there. I made a motion to consider what we're now calling C, ZOAC C. And that's what's on the floor to vote on. If that fails, then you go back and look at something else. I put it out there.
Okay.
That's all, just to go somewhere.
That's good. Procedural question?
it was not a formal motion. I think Ms. Bagley made that suggestion as a basis of discussion for the group.
Yeah, it's not a formal motion.
Yeah.
Sorry, I should put it out for consideration.
Correct. And so that's what everyone is responding to that. And then I think we're going to circle back and make sure we've got a summary. So we've got one final vote on the 3 different recommendations that we have, if we elect to move something forward today. So I think we've had a few people speak to what we're calling ZOAC C. And I was asking the members who haven't spoken if they had any thoughts they wanted to.
I didn't think we'd see this.
Well,
It's
if I
important.
may, Madam Chair?
Should all be here and give us our full attention and discussion.
Could we read ZOAC C?
Okay, go back to C.
What's that?
Yeah, there it is, right there.
So staff's
I can't see.
recommendation,
It's
and it just moves multifamily by right, and instead of all residential,
Single.
right, it's just single family for SUP.
Oh, here, come right here. Right here, right here. You don't have to walk that far.
Yeah.
Happy to share that.
Yeah. Okay, here you go. That's, okay, that's what it looks like.
That's what I noticed.
So, well, I think Mr. Hall and Ms. Bagley are reading what you all online are able to see on the screen in just a larger format. The monitor's pretty far away from us today. And so I'll just share my perspective while they're reading that. I took the time since our last meeting to go back and look at the cases that were heard by CPC. I think as Commissioner or Vice Chair Blair's mentioned, she had one in a single family district. We had two that were in multifamily districts. We had one that was a question about whether or not it should be a PD or an S.
Sorry, we've lost the audio again.
Me and how I have been evaluating those based on those most recent cases. And it really was trying to think about there hadn't, I think we did have cases where they were in smaller residential districts, smaller format, where there was a lot of discussion about how is the traffic going to be accommodated primarily around pickup and drop off? How does it fit into the character of the communities? But most of the cases were either within a multifamily building. There was very little, the biggest question that came out of comments to me was, is this going to be open and available to the public? Which I think speaks directly to Ms. May's point and Mr. Doss and the data that's coming forward to us from staff is that we do need more childcare facilities. And by dropping some of the boundaries, but I will also say, I've also heard from the residents who have concerns, just like I think everyone in this room, I have childcare facilities that are immediately surrounding me. Some are in churches, some are actually in converted houses. They've probably been there for 30 plus years. They're adjacent to a school. They are, I think they serve their communities best when they are able to be within their communities. So I think it does need to be a balance in my view in how they operate, particularly when we have, residential adjacencies as we look at all of these. But I think similar to where Ms. Bagley has put forward a suggestion, I think ZOAC C to me splits that balance. It provides additional flexibility. It breaks down barriers. It puts them where we've got uses where we probably don't need a childcare in an industrial area without having that evaluation if it makes sense. So I think I'm generally comfortable with C. I will say I was pretty good at ZOAC A, but I can certainly see removing the distance requirement that, by having the SUP, I think it allows for that evaluation that the distance would have put in and hopefully does make them more, as much as there is a barrier through the SUP process, that is removed. So that's where my thinking is right now.
Can I ask just one clarification?
You may.
ZOAC C.
Yes, Ms. McGregor, you're next.
Okay.
Mr. Doss is going to make one clarification for us.
So with the exception of being for CS and industrial from by right to SUP, ZOAC C is essentially, I would call it status quo. Okay. The only thing it does in terms of removing a barrier is allowing the by right and multifamily. It's maintaining yes. So there's yes. So thank you so much for throwing that at me. So it is removing a barrier for multifamily. So no more SUP in multifamily, and then no more limited use in MF3 and 4. But it is still maintaining the current standard of SUP in those other residential districts: the R's, the THs, the Ds, the CHs, and the NHs. So just
And
then yes, it does add the SUP for CS and industrial.
Somewhere in our case, somewhere in our case report, where are the districts where CS is current, or where childcare and adult care, as much as they're two separate things, where they're currently allowed.
So the
Because
best place to go is to scroll up and just look at the strikeouts in the staff recommendation.
And I guess the reason why I'm asking this clarification is, again, one of my cases, it moved from an LO to an NSA in order to allow the daycare facility to be. So by putting office in here, we're actually adding them within office districts, isn't that?
That's correct. I misspoke. The office would be from moving from limited use in office to by right in office.
Right.
What that does is essentially allows them larger floor area. It can be a main use in the office district, and it can now advertise
Right.
and be open to the public and have a door to the street.
And there's a breakdown of how many of these licensed facilities, by HHS, are per zoning district on page 29.
Thank you. So, Mr. McGregor, apologies, I wanted to make sure that we were clear on the districts that we were talking about.
Of course. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to go back to if SUPs are intended to protect the neighborhoods from nuisances from businesses in general. If I knew of any nuisance that child care or adult care facility has created any evidence at all, then yeah, that I would support putting an SUP. So I don't see the evidence. Other than us imagining potential problems. I don't see the evidence of nuisance, and an SUP is not, it's onerous to the business owner, right? It's not something you just go online and fill it out and you print out your SUP. We all know that people go through a process and a timetable and an expense to get their SUPs, and they have to keep coming back to these SUPs over time to renew them. So I'm really technically not in favor of any of the boxes because they require SUPs. However, the least restrictive and least offensive is staff's recommendation. I still don't know why we have to require SUPs, other than we're imagining that industrial CS might somehow hurt kids, but we're not taking into account the fact that a mom or dad would consider the facility before letting their kids in there. I could settle for staff's recommendation, but not for any of the others, for these two reasons. These are not nuisance type businesses, and two, the SUP is going to limit many women from going back into the workforce, and some men. That's where I am.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you.
I have two comments. The CS and the industrial are with an SUP are not there to protect the neighborhood. They're there to protect the industrial and the CS from having conflicting uses that eliminate or make it harder to do the industrial development there. That's my point on that. As far as having things once you say something is by right in a single family residential district, yes, we don't know if it'll make a nuisance or not. But you're saying, okay, wow, now you can do these anywhere. And yes, there is a need, but I think you need to know where they're going to go for various reasons. And that's why I put this forward. Whether I vote for it or not, who knows?
Thank you, Ms. Bagley. So, Mr. Hall, if you want to just hold, I think I'm going to ask for a motion so that we can formally get this and move on. So I don't want to put you on the spot, but we want to make sure if you did have any comments you wanted to share.
I'll just comment that I prefer staff's recommendations, but I'm considering C.
Okay. Well, and thank you. Didn't mean to put you on the spot. Like I said, just didn't want to overlook you in our discussion. So with that, I am going to ask if we can have a formal motion in a second so that we can try to move this forward. Ms. Bagley.
A formal motion for the wording in what we're calling ZOAC C, which would be districts permitted by right, multifamily, and all those other things, and by SUP in residential districts except MF, as your wording added, and not in CS or industrial.
Is there a second? Thank you, Vice Chair Blair, for your second. So We have,
Is it not allowed in CS? And it doesn't.
by SUP.
By SUP.
Oh, okay, sorry, I thought I heard not.
No, it was the exception, you know,
Okay, all right.
Okay, so we
not by
have,
right, but by SUP.
we have a motion by Ms. Bagley, a second by Vice Chair Blair to consider moving forward ZOAC C, moving that on to City Plan Commission as proposed amendments. So but any further discussion?
Is there any way to
Well, yeah, sure.
We're gonna do them all at the end.
I'm sorry,
So
was
there
it
a-
seconded? Is there a second, Madam Chair?
Yes, it was
Okay.
seconded by Vice Chair Blair.
Okay, perfect.
So-
So yeah, discussion if we do, and I guess at this point it's just to go on the record. So the only part I don't like about C is that it requires SUP in single family essentially, right? And there's no reason that we know of other than the potential problems that we can imagine to require SUP there. It will put in a significant limitation for those communities' abilities to provide a very much needed service. And so no, for that reason, I will not be able to support this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Any further discussion? Hearing none, I'm going to call the vote. So all in favor of moving forward ZOAC C to CPC, say aye. Aye. Those opposed?
Nay.
Just to.
Okay, so I heard a nay from Mr. McGregor and Mr. Hall.
Nay.
And a nay from Mr. Baring. So. She can't vote. She can't vote. So I had Bagley, Reeves, Blair, and Hampton in support. I had Hall, McGregor, and Baring against. So motion passes. Okay, so we have two more items to get to, and then we're going to do a summary to make sure we all know where we've landed. So our next item is on page 15 of our case report. This is regarding off-street parking. We have a staff recommendation for off-street parking requirement of none, and then the required off-street parking. And I think Mr. Doss has just pulled it up on the screen so that everyone won't reread what's in our case report. So is there a motion, our next motion on off-street parking?
Wait, I have to read it. Let me read it for a second. Sorry, staff recommend, can I read it out loud for everybody? So we all at the same page?
Well, it's on the screen and
Okay, then let me read it to myself.
at page 16,
Okay.
you can read it out loud.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I read it.
Okay, any further discussion before we try to move this forward?
This is unchanged from what's on page 15.
Correct. We have no notes that,
Okay, correct.
unless somebody wants to make a comment at this point, but what we
Well,
have.
I will, as long as you're allowing, I will make a quick comment. So it's really big I think for all of us to understand that not requiring off-street parking does not mean encouraging no parking or reducing parking. What it really is, the only thing it's doing, it's really not letting city code make that decision. We know from tons and tons of data all across the country that the code is wrong, and it's caused many problems, and I won't go into all of that. We'll get to that when we talk about parking reform, but most urban planners, if not all of them, agree that eliminating park minimums is the best answer in terms of urban design. It does not mean that there won't be parking allowed. It does not mean that you're going to create a problem in the streets. It simply means that the decision is made locally, and the incentive for the local business to make the decision is if they make the wrong decision, then their business will fail. There are issues with that. There are weaknesses to that approach, but those weaknesses far offset the problems that you have if you go the other way, if you have the city codify those requirements. So I go for staff's recommendation.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Mr. Reeves.
I'm wondering, given that we just said an SUP in these single-family districts, does it really matter? Because if we were saying you got to have one space in a business, you know, is in a single family and they want to, well, okay, we have our one space, but you're like, oh, wait a minute, that's way overwhelming. They're not going to get their SUP. And if we said none and they were way overwhelming, they're not going to get their SUP. So I'm not seeing much of a difference potentially, or is there a difference? I should ask the question.
And I'm looking to staff. Staff, based on the recommendation on the districts allowed.
I think he's got a great point that, you know, if an SUP is required in single family
That's
districts,
That's where the parking can be.
So,
Okay.
even if it's in the.
So, stand by one, I'm gonna let staff answer, then we have Mr. Baring and then Ms. Bagley.
tell me, Sarah, Ms. May, tell me what you think, but I think that unbracketed portion of an SUP is required, that's always been there.
Right,
So
that's always been in the
we-
code.
just-
Well, not always, but
it's
it
always-
is
it's
currently.
there. So that says basically the SUP can overrule in either direction.
Right, but that's there because it currently says 1,500.
But now if ZOAC were to move forward with this requested one space based on zoning district,
Right,
the SUP can still.
yeah, we still don't need that language there. That language is there to allow the SUP to change it off of 1,500.
Well, it can always go up. That allows it to go down.
Right, that allows it to go down.
So do we want to allow by SUP to go down for one or two? I think it's a question.
Right.
Okay, so we have an answer. So I'll try to be as succinct as possible, but you guys have known me for long enough. We'll see what happens. So currently, an SUP can always be more restrictive than the base code. So currently, 1 to 500, and an SUP could place a requirement that is higher than that.
Or lower.
Or lower. Currently.
Well,
Yeah.
let me back up. If it didn't have the bracketed portion, an SUP, in general, an SUP can always be more restrictive. The bracketed portion, if an SUP is required, the off-street parking requirement may be established. That piece allows, in this specific case, it allows an SUP to reduce the parking below to a number below that 1 to 500, or to an ultimate number below. So that sentence lets the SUP go up or down. It can always go up. This lets it go down. The question now for the body, I think, is if the body's going to move forward with the one space for the R75 and R5 and TH, and 2 spaces in the other residential districts, and you have the SUP for the single family districts, do you want that SUP to allow a parking reduction or not?
So if the body wants to consider the ZOAC requested, then we may also want to consider the SUP language as a part of that. So saw Mr. Baring's hand and then Ms. Bagley. Mr. Baring.
Yeah, I just couldn't recall since our last meeting, in the language under ZOAC requested why there would be 2 different standards depending on the zoning district that the use resides in. I mean, if it's the same use, then why 1 space in R and 2 in the others?
So, well, not currently, but in general, but for a single family use in R75.
So I think staff is
Sidebar.
going to answer your question. Stand by, Mr.
We're
Baring.
working on an answer. You can answer, you know it, and you answer.
I think I wasn't listening closely enough to answer that question. Could you
Why?
repeat it?
Why do we have an R versus why is it 1 space in R versus 2 spaces in all other districts?
Oh,
Or like R16,
what?
R15.
Okay, well, that's the same standard that's in single family use, and that's what I heard from ZOAC last time, is that you wanted to match single family parking requirements. And so that's why we have it stated as such. That's the question, right?
So, yeah,
Okay.
Mr. Berry, does that answer your question? It essentially brings forward a standard that matches the current district is what
Yeah.
today is stated
for single family use.
for single family. And so instead of being 1 to 500, that's the current standard, it a standard there, but not as,
The discussion was,
I don't know whether it's restricted.
if you're gonna build a childcare facility in a single family neighborhood, the number of parking spaces for that childcare facility should be the same as for a home. And for a single family home, in an R75 or R5 or a TH, the current requirement is 1 space. And in all the other residential districts, or in all the other single family districts, R13, R10, the requirement is 2 spaces.
And
So-
in that,
And that's my bedroom, but so then,
no, not for single family.
oh, for single,
For a
you're right, for single family.
multi-family.
So yeah, that's correct. So this is the exact same parking requirement as for a single family use in these respective districts.
And then as written, it's none in all other districts.
Correct.
So, Ms. Bagley,
I have to agree with Mr. McGregor on a portion of what he said. I think in the commercial districts, industrial, all of those, we so overpark them now that those need to be determined by good urban design, what the building's actually used for. However, in protecting neighborhoods, I think that if you break out where we can have if there's an SUP, the parking requirement would be determined by the SUP and not by the base zoning. So that just protects it. I mean, it depends on the lot, it depends on the configuration, it depends on a lot of things. But I think you need to let the SUP determine if it's a corner lot, there are a lot of things different in that. So none for everybody else, except the ones that require the SUP. Then that would be determined by the SUP.
So it's basically staff's recommendation, just a clarifying question. If you look at staff's recommendation and just delete the last piece of that, if you were
No.
to, like, required off-street parking, if an SUP is required for use, the off-street parking requirement may be established in the ordinance granting the SUP, period.
Yeah.
And to delete the otherwise 1 space per 500 square foot, just delete that last, everything after the comma. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
I think what staff is saying is that in any use that requires an SUP, CPC and council can increase the amount of parking that's required.
Right, I'm talking about a ZOAC request today. It's basically staff's recommendation minus that last everything, otherwise deleting otherwise 1 space per 500 square foot. I think that's what ZOAC's B is.
Yeah, that's
Ms. May, can you respond, please?
right. So what I'm saying is that for any use that requires an SUP, the SUP can require more than what 51A requires, so for a bar, you could say, I know the parking requirement's 1 for 100, but I think you need more than that.
Yeah.
So
We
we
need to
don't
state
need
that.
that.
So we do not need to write the statement that if an SUP is required for this use, off-street parking may be established in the ordinance granting the SUP, because that's base code.
Exactly, right.
So, and when
Staff recommendation.
But if you have an SUP, you could,
It could be more. So of course, if,
but it's still 1 or 2 in those districts.
Only-
None, no, just none. Okay, got it.
or we follow staff's recommendation, so I'm
Yeah.
gonna try to restate it,
Staff
and I'm gonna ask staff to ask if this is correct. If the body were to move forward, staff recommendation that required off-street parking is none. We have recommended 3 districts where there is an SUP required. Today, that SUP could establish the parking at whatever amount, even if it was described as none in this, in the.
That's exactly right.
Is that clear to everybody? Because I still am not sure I said it very well.
Oh, yeah, it is.
But just to clarify, as long as we're basing it off of the original staff's recommendation, that recommendation did not include SUPs for single family. So this is a completely new box, right? Because it does have
Yeah,
that. It should be.
I think what staff is saying, and I'll let staff confirm, is that even if none is passed by this body, the parking can still be established in an SUP.
Correct.
Okay,
So it's that.
so,
Correct.
and am I hearing a consensus around staff's recommendation,
Yes.
required off-street parking of none?
Correct.
Okay. Show of hands so that I can see those online. Everyone here is nodding yes. I think I'm seeing everybody nodding yes. So we have consensus on staff recommendation on off-street parking.
Well, wait, oh, hang on. I'm not seeing what oh, wait a minute. So we have consensus on staffs. Did we add the but an SUP can
It's not
vary
necessary.
it?
Not necessary.
Staff has told us is that is not necessary
Okay.
because the parking can be established in an SUP.
And it's, yeah.
It does not have to be stated that the SUP can be where it could be established then.
Correct.
And
Okay.
and staff is nodding and saying yes. So hopefully we'll have that online. Okay, so our last box is on Board of Adjustment. And so this is special exceptions, generally page 16 of our staff report.
Do we have to vote on this or?
Well, I'm gonna do a summary of, we've
Okay.
done all three, and here's what we believe
Okay,
moving
okay,
forward. Is
all right.
that acceptable to the city attorney? Okay,
Okay,
and will that be clear for staff?
Yep.
Okay,
okay. I was making sure we're all on the same page. And
Yeah.
we're on the same chapter, same page.
yeah.
And
again,
same paragraph, same line.
I'm happy to take a vote, but I think everyone said yes, staff recommendation.
Okay.
All right, we are on additional provisions, Romanet E3. And so we've got a staff recommendation and we have a ZOAC request.
Can I ask a question here?
Yes, Commissioner Carpenter.
If these boxes are specifically pertaining to residential, childcare, adult daycare and in residential, if we have now decided that an SUP is required, I'm not understanding this, because can the Board of Adjustment grant a special exception in defiance of what the SUP established?
So,
Ms. Knight, sure.
So that's a great point. These are all great points now that, all the districts permitted have changed, ZOAC. I think it would be more streamlined for the SUP process if the SUP in these residential districts could determine exceptions for these structures. And can that happen legally?
An SUP.
Yeah, so it wouldn't have to be Board of Adjustment still, right? Yeah.
But can the Board of Adjustment approve a special exception that would put the property in violation of its site plan?
That is not a question I have the answer to at this moment. I can look into that.
So back to, I think, a question that Commissioner Carpenter asked earlier. The variance process would still be open, is that correct?
I would have to double check on that.
But if I may, but when I was making the earlier comments about variance versus special exception, that's when we weren't, we hadn't already landed on requiring an SUP for single family residential. Right. So given that these boxes are just for single family residential and we're instating we're keeping the SUP requirement, I'm just trying to figure out legally what the Board of Adjustment can do, either through special exception or variances for that matter. Might as clarify the whole thing at once. If the SUP conditions have to be complied with and it has to be in compliance with its site plan, I'm vague. I'm very unclear as to what could actually be done here by Board of Adjustment if a SUP is required.
Yeah, and let me add something that we need to think about as we do this, because I know it's practical to go through each item and figure out roughly where we all sit on it, and planning for the the bigger motion, I think. But these are all ultimately going to interact with as a whole, right? And I'm concerned a little bit that when this gets to city council, if we, what am I trying to say? They're not going to know that they're going to look at one decision. They're going to look at the whole ordinance, not realizing that, hey, when we agreed to do it this way, it's because we assumed there would be that would require SUP at single family. But if they start reading in and choose to part of the reason why I'm putting things on the record is the hope that at some point in the future, some members of city council will look into, well, what was the other way of thinking about this? So let's just remember, there's even though distant, there's a possibility that at council, when it gets there, they may say, hey, no, we need to remove SUPs from single family. But then they won't look at revising the rest of this stuff. So for your benefit, I just want everybody to know that it's not a given that at the very end SUPs will stay in single family. So that affects how all these other additional pieces are written into the code. It's confusing, I know, but and we're doing the best we can.
So, thank you, Mr. McGregor. I think Ms. May has a clarification for us.
Right, and I just kind of want to also elaborate on some other just sort of problems that might arise with the combination of an SUP and Board of Adjustment. So the SUP, like Mr. Doss aptly reminded us, can't relieve property owners of like yard, lot, and space problems unless it's through a variance and things like that, or as prescribed by the code, such as proposed. And then also, if a Board of Adjustment takes action to grant a request, the property owner has to apply for a permit within 180 days of that action for it to remain, allowed. So that's another problem that we've seen in some other uses like cell towers, because cell towers obviously are tall. And in the past, I did a code amendment program. But before the code was amended, if the cell tower was allowed in a residential district, it had to get an SUP. And there was issues between the SUP being granted and then also the Board of Adjustment had to grant, relief from residential proximity slope and things like that. So there was a lot of issues with a business going through SUP and Board of Adjustment in the past. So,
and also, does this come into play? So the SUP first goes through CPC, right? So the assumption is that once CPC agrees to that, it can't go to Board of Adjustment. So am I right to think that the SUP trumps Board of Adjustment or is above Board of Adjustment?
Right. So Ms. May, can you state how the SUP is considered and what can be within an SUP versus what might be a special exception?
Right, so the SUP cannot grant relief to yard, lot, and space, like setbacks or height or things like that. And also the SUP can't allow something that the zoning doesn't allow. So the SUP can't have a site plan that shows structures in the front yard setback unless they're granted relief from that setback. So it's a very fine line and complicated process to try to get these two processes to go through the system concurrently to get approval from both bodies, by SUP and by Board of Adjustment. And it's complicated.
Is this really needed in this section? Is this at this point?
And that's, I think, where some of us are.
Yeah, I don't, if you've not, now you've got an SUP and you've got all these other businesses, if they need an exception, they would go. I mean, they're allowed by right, but they want taller, they've got to go to the Board of Adjustment. Now you've got an SUP that sets the parameters for what you can do. I don't see how, except you used the cell phone tower as an example, but that got convoluted too. I don't think this section's needed. In this document, you've got all the other stuff in the zoning ordinance for variances and special exceptions.
I think that was the point that Commissioner Carpenter was
Yeah,
trying to
I think,
highlight.
well, just.
Right.
Yeah,
It
we,
just,
we all caught up with Commissioner Carpenter.
yeah. Would you like me to reiterate why we proposed in the first place?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. May is going to remind us why special exceptions were brought before us to begin with.
Right, so, you know, we have a lot of areas that, can be really restrictive, like if you're on a corner lot, there's a lot of times it has 2 front yard setbacks. Parking is not allowed in the front yard setback in residential districts, you know, the playground structures are not allowed in the front yard of residential districts, or shade structures, you know, your front yard has to be, open and unobstructed. And so, given the possibility that, you know, a site may be needed, worthy of some exceptions, we were trying to afford a standard that was less restrictive than the variance standard for putting things in the setbacks, either whether it be parking or structures or whatever that may be. And that was why it was proposed. It's just to allow a process that didn't require having to meet a restrictive size, shape, or slope lot.
And so so I think Mr. McGregor rightly raised the question about, okay, we've got sort of 2 things we're talking about here. We have what is the current direction that ZOAC is considering moving forward. And Commissioner Carpenter raised the question, do we still need the special exception if there's an SUP? So can you just okay, we've got an SUP. There are special exceptions that are currently allowed to go to Board of Adjustment within residential districts.
So special exceptions only exist where they've been created in the code.
So
Variance-
carports,
variance
for
is-
instance, and,
Fence,
yeah, fence.
landscape, fence, trees.
But the SUP can't, if let's say they need an SUP and they also want to, they
Park in the front yard.
They need to play, they want to place some outdoor recreation equipment in a side yard or front yard. The SUP cannot allow them to do that because the SUP cannot be less restrictive than the base code. So if the body desires that process to be possible, we still need this section. They would just have to have that special exception granted alongside the SUP that's going to allow them to do the use.
So they would in fact have to get both.
Yes.
And then if there were a different change, the special exception would still be a possibility.
So that's gonna stretch things way out. So which comes first, chicken or egg? You know,
So
do you go get the special exception before you get your SUP?
Usually not, because
Yeah.
you only have 180 days.
Yeah. It's
Yeah.
short term. I think the other rest of the code covers.
Could you grant the SUP based on their success of getting the exception?
It's a climate change.
Question for staff?
It's not conditional.
If we're really on top of our game, usually they'll delay the council, putting it on the council agenda to let the Board of Adjustment process catch up with them. Otherwise, they might just be in a hurry and say, Board, we really need you to approve this because we need to start getting our permits.
Okay,
It's 6 months anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then go amend your issues.
so
Checklist.
Commissioner Carpenter, and if there's other hands, I'm not seeing them. Commissioner Carpenter?
Right. No, my feeling here is if the SUP, during the SUP process, we look, it seems exhausting, and go through an exhaustive process of deciding, where all these things ought to be. I don't see the relevance anymore in making it easier to get a special exception. I would remove this section altogether and just let it default to the regular rules for variances. But once again, that's my opinion.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Carpenter. Further discussion, or would anyone like to either make a motion or make a? Mr. Reeves?
I will disagree with Commissioner Carpenter on this one. And I think this is needed because there are weird, funky shaped lots, size, spacing. There are 2 front yards in many lots if you're on a corner. And if it was zone multifamily, and then I could still see that you would need one of these exceptions. And, the process of working them out in tandem, a little cumbersome, if there's an SUP involved, but I think this does allow some flexibility.
Yeah, and I would, man.
Yes, Mr. McGregor and then Ms. Bagley.
Yeah, and I would agree with Mr. Reeves, and I would, because, again, not knowing how many possible iterations there might be of where an SUP, I'm sorry, where a special exception might be helpful to someone. If this provides one more tool for, childcare centers to tailor their specific needs to fit with what the city requires, then yeah, put it in there. If it's not relevant, they won't use it. And if it is, then it's there as a potential tool, unless that were to somehow conflict with how things are written and how it interacts with the SUP. But I don't mind keeping it.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Ms. Bagley?
I would I'm changing tunes here, but I would think that the staff recommendation covers everything you need to cover. We had looked at the other that was there to protect the single family neighborhoods, to get the Board of Adjustment to look at all this other stuff before saying that it would work. So I would go with, if you're gonna leave it in, which I don't think it needs to be, but if you're gonna leave it in, then it just needs to be staff's recommendation.
Thank you, Ms. Bagley. Any further discussion? Does anyone want to, Mr. Baring, do I see a hand?
Sure. As usual, I think we're talking about this applying to a range of operators. And I want to put myself in someone's shoes for a minute. I'm trying to imagine being a neighbor who wants to provide a second income for their family and have 8 to 12 children at their house. And having to go through both an SUP and a Board of Adjustment process to put a swing set in their front yard or something like that. I mean, I used to be on Board of Adjustment. It is very onerous. It's just, this stuff is, we are part of the reason Dallas is shrinking, to be honest with you. I mean, we should not be providing barriers to small businesses. And, again, the process of natural selection, survival of the fittest. I mean, there's lots of hoops that people have to jump through. I don't know why we're willingly providing more of them. I mean, I'm not sure what we're protecting neighborhoods from. If it's protecting them from a swing set, I mean, I don't. I'm not sure what we're talking about. These are long processes, long administrative processes that add costs, significant costs to small businesses. So I can't support layering that on.
Could I clarify something, please?
Stand by, Commissioner Carpenter.
Okay, sure.
I had a clarification.
Yes, so if this Romanet 3 is not present, then there is no way other than a variance to allow outdoor recreation equipment in the side yard. So, and as you know, the variance is a much higher bar to meet than the special exception bar. The SUP, whether it's there or not, the SUP cannot allow for a violation of a side yard setback. So if the desire is a less onerous process, then this is the less onerous process.
Relatively speaking, I appreciate that.
Yes, relatively speaking.
Thank you, Mr. Berry. Commissioner Carpenter?
No, points taken. I understand the reasoning behind following staff recommendation. I can get on board with that. I would vastly prefer that to the ZOAC requested version for the reasons that Ms. Bagley said. But I did want to, if I understood, I have a question of Mr. Baring. You were talking about these provisions applying to someone who wanted to keep a certain number of children in their own home that they lived in. This would not have it. That's day home. That's by right. These rules would not apply to that at all. Did I misunderstand what you were saying?
Did we not in our first agenda item apply the SUP to all number of children?
That only for child care centers. Day home, when someone resides in their own home and keeps children, up to 12 children there, that's by right. It has nothing to do with, nothing we're talking about today affects that at all.
It's under accessory uses on page 16.
Right. I'm just trying to make sure we're on the same page because
Yeah, it's a good clarification. So our last,
we're not talking about applying an SUP process to a day home. People all have the right now and will continue to have the right to live in their home and run an accessory day home where they bring up to 12 kids in their home and take care of them.
Wonder how we enforce that.
I did have a question. Staff is how you can enforce. How do you enforce the 12 limit on day home, but it's impossible to determine or enforce for a daycare center? But
all right, so members, I'm going to try to have us our final box that we have before us. I think we've had a robust discussion on the Board of Adjustment additional provisions. I think I heard a few folks speak in favor of staff recommendation. Is that the consensus of our body? Or is there further discussion or any amendments needed on that? I'm seeing nods and hearing no nays. So I think I'm hearing consensus on staff recommendation. So I know there's a lot of other edits within our proposed amendments, but those were the only boxes we had. So I think we just covered that we still have accessory structures with the day home. And Mr. Doss or Ms. May, is it correct? Those are just bringing the language forward with current regulations. Is that correct? There's no substantial change that we haven't talked about?
For in the day home?
Yeah.
So for the day home, the accessory use day home, there's kind of two main things. Is there's some language clarification about how we're not count if there's a foster child, that caring for a foster child does not make you a day home. You're operating a day care center. But it brings that combined use concept into day home. So it's not only children, it's persons of any age can be cared for under the day home accessory use. It's increasing the maximum from 10 to 12 to align with state standards for in-home care centers. And there's just some more clarifying language on the who counts as an attendee and who doesn't count.
Okay. Any questions from anybody on that? We talked about it previously. We didn't have any boxes. I just wanted to make sure we were all clear where we are in the language. Okay, I'm seeing none. You guys are, then our other two items that are within here are maximum lot coverage and our maximum building height. And Mr. Dawson, I know you covered this in your briefing earlier, but this is removing the exclusions on institutional use, or exceptions, I should say.
Yes, so it would require that the new child or adult daycare facility to meet the same lot coverage and height standards as the residential.
Okay, and it's really just specific to residential districts, correct?
Yeah. Okay, that's basically really no change.
Right. So,
well, currently they can go 60% and no maximum height. But,
as an institutional use, but
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, also in residential, but you would have to get an SUP.
Yeah. Yes. That's exactly.
So I'm going to try to summarize, and we can do a formal motion for staff to help if we need to. Oh, yes, Ms. May has a follow-up before we.
And since, everybody's been so good about, bringing up, the rest of the report with the recommendation of an SUP in the lower density residential districts. do we want to, I mean, the standards to keep them, consistent with residential was with the perspective of allowed by right. But now that an SUP can further restrict yard, lot, and space things like height and lot coverage, is that something that you want to further restrict the adult and child care facilities with, the
Can I,
WAC requested C?
can I attempt?
Vice Chair Blair.
If SUP can be more restrictive, why would we want to be more restrictive than more restrictive? So if the SUP can be more restrictive than the base code, then what do we need anything else more restrictive?
Exactly.
So I would say no.
Okay.
That if the SUP can be more restricted, from what I'm doing in my own head is, and that's scary, why would I want to restrict more than what the SUP can restrict? Let the SUP do its job.
And so with that, so are you recommending no change to the yard, lot, and space sections?
Yes.
We're only working on 3 things, and the rest stays.
Per the case report.
Yes.
Okay. Did everyone online follow that? Any final questions or discussion?
I agree with what Vice Chair Blair had to say. I mean, the reason why I made a point of those particular issues previously was because we were discussing the possibility of childcare by right in residential, and we have those institutional exceptions, which would have allowed those new commercial structures to be any height allowed by FAA and much larger lot coverage. But if it's no longer by right and it's by SUP, then I can go. I understand why it would not be necessary any longer.
So, Commissioner Carpenter, I do think we might, I want to make sure I understand what we're talking about. I understood that we were maintaining the case report as listed because it includes MF districts, MH districts, NOA, NSA, relative to the institution of buildings, not just single family.
But let me ask a question. Does those districts say that the coverage can be
60%?
60%. So that's basically base code, right?
It's increased. So
it's increased. Is it increased base code?
Right. So it varies depending on what district you're in. But yeah.
But essentially,
Why do you have to make things so hard?
but essentially, in R75A, for a residential use, the lot coverage is 45%. For a non-residential use, it's 25%.
But for an
For an institutional use, it's 60%. But the SUP could place that limit.
So let me ask you a question.
Place it.
Can I ask?
Yeah, it could place it anywhere between 60 and 0%.
So can I ask a question?
Vice Chair Blair.
Please. Because y'all getting ready to make me pull my hair out. Why would we want to change what base code is?
So we
Is that a good question?
All questions are good questions.
Yeah, based on the discussion from the May 30th discussion on, we don't want these giant institutional childcare, adult daycare facilities in single family neighborhoods to overwhelm the neighborhood that they're in bulk. We were recommending adding, restrictions to make it the same restriction as residential uses. But if they're going to be restricted by SUP, it might be better for, the applicant, the community, and CPC and council and everybody involved to have that leeway to allow them to restrict it to 60% or less through the SUP process. So I don't know if that's something that, as Chair Hampton brought up, that maybe you want to make those restrictions more restrictive in the multifamily districts, if you want to allow them by right in multifamily districts, or if we're okay with childcare facilities and adult daycare facilities getting the same 60% lot coverage allowed as like a church would in those same districts.
Yeah. And Ms. May, if I may, you were just trying to highlight that as we've gone through all these districts and all the discussion, is there any adjustment that the body wanted to consider within these two sections?
Exactly.
I have a question.
Yes, Ms. Bagley.
Way back, it was when a church went in for institutional use in a residential district. They had to abide by the setbacks, the height. This 60% thing, when did that come in? Because that wasn't in way back. When did that 60% get for the institutional uses? Or did we just miss it for 10 years? But
Oh, it's been there at least 15 years since I've started. So
well, I don't remember it being there when I went on ZOAC 18 years. I mean, when I went on ZOAC and CPC in 2005. And it's not in other zoning ordinances that I'm familiar with, because I've written several. It's usually that church has to meet all the same requirements. So I'm just, the 60% came as kind of I'm remote from Dallas on that, but it was a surprise. Because I don't remember it being adopted.
So, thank you, Ms. Bagley. I think where I thought we were, I'm going to restate it, and y'all can redirect us as we need to be, is that we were going to move forward to City Plan Commission, the proposed amendments per the case report with the following changes, which were ZOAC C for the districts where allowed, and to follow staff recommendation for off-street parking and for the additional provisions, which are 4.204 E Romanet 3, otherwise known as page 16 of our case report.
Otherwise known as
Yeah, Board of Adjustment. So are there any further discussion? Do we want to make any further refinements based on this last discussion? I think I'm comfortable with where we're at, but again, it's the will of the body, so we want to make sure that we've answered all the questions that we have before we move this forward.
I'll second your motion.
Okay, well,
Wait, that's not a motion, is it?
I know, it wasn't formally a motion, that was a summary, but I will certainly entertain a motion if you would like to make that, Mr. Hall.
She said.
you know what she said.
Sure, I will move what you just said. That sounds good. I may not vote for it, but.
Yeah, and no one's required to vote for it, so, is there a second?
I will.
Thank you, Vice Chair Blair.
So we talked about lot coverage. And I think one piece is, so I'm trying to get back to where we were. So let's say we're in an MF1A zoning district. The non-residential lot coverage is maximum is 25%.
No, I'm looking at multifamily and the base code is 60% lot coverage. And I'm looking at it right with it. MF dwelling and lot coverage, maximum lot coverage is 60%. for residential structure and 50% for non-residential structure. And that's in section 51A 4.116.
So you
I
said
wrote it down.
60%
It's
residential?
60%. I'm reading it. I'm actually reading it. Maximum lot coverage is 60% for residential structures and 50% for non-residential structures. I've gone through 40% in residential and 25% for non-residential structures. And then when you go into townhouse duplex, it's 60% maximum. Multifamily is 60%. Now I'm getting ready to scroll through the rest of them.
Right.
To see if the lot coverage is, because what we're saying is 60, the maximum lot coverage is 60%.
Except as provided in paragraph 2 is how this starts. And then within paragraph 2, it says that the lot coverage applicable to residential structures for each district.
And which is 60% and 50 in MF1, MF.
Yeah, so we and putting that because what we're saying is we don't really need these exceptions proposed in the staff report.
Because
it's because it would be 60% anyway.
and it's faulting back to base code.
Right.
So we don't, the maximum lot coverage, when we took out the residential but got SUP, it all falls back to base code. So we don't need this section at all.
Right. Yeah, we just say no change.
No change.
To those sections.
Maximum lot coverage is no change based on what we have done with number C, ZOAC C. Yay!
There's a future.
Still got level to go.
Okay. Commissioner Carpenter, we're in discussion. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I've lost the section that we were looking at here about. 'Cause I think, okay, because where we addressing what Ms. Bagley said, I think it was kind of a kind of subterranean in the code that it doesn't spell out under. If you look up the rules for single family, townhomes, multifamily, it gives you the lot coverage, but it doesn't spell out that there's an exception for institutional uses. That's sort of hidden away in another part of the code. And so that was something that we had a more robust discussion of this whole lot coverage issue for institutional uses, came about, through this discussion, because I think it's been generally understood in neighborhoods that institutions such as churches and schools, get extra. They get extra lot coverage. They can get some extra height, although it's been a bit of a shocker in the last year or two, from my point of view, to all of a sudden hear staff say that these buildings can be any height allowable by the FAA and that residential proximity slope doesn't apply, but they say that's always been in the code. Okay. But where this came from is, do we think that if we're talking about adding daycare, adult daycare by right in a lot of these different use categories, do we want to afford them the same increases that that churches and schools get? And I think for daycare, we kind of came down that no, we didn't want to do that. As far as, is this still necessary? The more I look at this, I guess I have a question for staff, which is why I'm not looking at the right, let's see, what looks as if between what the Romanette that starts except under, okay, paragraph 2, there are a lot of different categories here, but when we get to 2, everything drops off after MF2. What was the reason for dropping MF3 and MH and NOA and NSA? Why was it considered that they could still have this increase for lot coverage for a daycare center when those are greater than the base requirements in
Greater.
the underlying zoning district.
So, so paragraph 1 here, we're not proposing any change, so that's as
Right.
is today. I can't speak to
Right.
why, but for example, the MF3A zoning district, the residential and non-residential lot coverage maximums are already 60%.
Okay,
So-
but MH is 20%.
Hold on.
MHA is 20%.
For example, like,
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
looking at the chart, and NOA is, let's see, where is it here? NOA is 50%, and NSA is 40%. So was there was there an intent to increase the lot coverage in those particular use categories for this one use?
not by us, because again, we're not recommending any change to paragraph 1.
No, I know that, but I'm talking about number 2.
That you didn't
Because the
include.
effect of number 2 increases the lot coverage for this use for some of these categories, MH, NO, and NSA.
So that would be 1, because that wasn't part of the discussion at ZOAC.
Right.
And also, there's no, I don't know if there's a residential lot coverage maximum for NSA, that would be weird to me.
Yeah.
Because there's no residential uses allowed in NSA. So that wouldn't be relevant to include there.
Okay.
So does the body want to leave 4.407 per current code or move it forward as our case report?
I would say that you would leave it per current codes,
No.
Leave it as is.
or you want to, or leave it. But in here, let's see, in single family, except in period provided in single family duplex townhouse.
It's-
But see, it,
It's under the thing.
Yeah. It's item 2. I think item 2 is truly what the change is. It adds that the residential structures is what governs for the listed districts, single family duplex, townhouse, MF districts.
And the question is, since you now have the SUP requirement in single family duplex, townhouse, and those other districts, do you need to limit them to the residential maximum, or do you want to allow the SUP to limit it in lieu of blanket?
So the only one I believe that we would remove would be single family from this list.
Right.
So the SUP requirement is still would be under the ZOAC requested, or what will be ZOAC recommendation. ZOAC C, single family duplex, townhouse, cluster house, and manufactured home all require an SUP for.
So question, how, if we're limiting that by SUP and someone didn't get their SUP renewed, what happens?
we got too many people talking at once.
Mr. Reeves, can you say that again?
Yes, if we're limiting, percent lot coverage by an SUP, then, and that SUP goes away, then what happens to that lot coverage? It seems like we want the lot coverage not related to an SUP.
Well, I have never seen a SUP go away. You have?
Yes.
Oh,
Go away.
Oh, yes, we have.
Because what time frames on.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
That's why the
Right.
SUP further restricts. It doesn't
Give more.
allow more.
So
Okay.
then, so then we can't, then the maximum lot coverage should not further, I don't know, it should, right,
It should be based on.
it should be based zoning.
So
Which means that we keep what's in the case report.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Which is keeping Two.
Teaching too, yes.
Keeping two. Okay. So I will thank Ms. May for highlighting that so we could fully vet it. Okay, so we have a motion by Mr. Hall. We have a second by Vice Chair Blair to move forward to CPC, the proposed amendments in the case report with the following changes: that the ZOAC C governs for districts allowed, and that its staff recommendation for off-street parking and additional provisions 40204 E Romanet 3 regarding Board of Adjustment.
Correct.
Okay. I think we've vetted through additional discussion on the max building height and lot coverage. Is there any further discussion?
Madam Chair? Oh, sorry, just comments. The motion is on, right?
Motion, yeah, comments on the motion.
Okay, so my comment at this point is really just meant to be, if you will, a message in the bottle, in the hopes that at some point, City Council will pick it up and read what, if any, things could be different about this, what ZOAC is proposing. Essentially, I will go back to the idea that requiring SUPs in non-multifamily districts is unnecessary. There is no evidence, nor is it likely that any community would ever be deteriorated by the over proliferation of childcare or adult care centers. On the other hand, well, and on that point, I can more likely see the possibility of, say, a young working couple looking to buy a home in a single family community or well, let's say non-multifamily community, and wanting a home in a community that does have good accessibility to childcare centers. So that, I think, is a more likely scenario than the idea that it's somehow gonna, the childcare centers are gonna deteriorate any community. And again, to reiterate, the ability to lower this restriction on childcare centers will have a positive impact on the quality of life of many individuals. It will fill a need that is unmet, as we already know, and it will likely allow particularly women to go back or be in the workforce. So I will respectfully not support the motion for that reason. Again, I'm gonna tie my message in, put it in a bottle, and hope that it gets picked up when it gets to council in case they are open to considering a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Any further discussion? Any further comments? So all those in favor say aye.
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 And those opposed?
Nay?
So I have Mr. McGregor voting no.
Correct.
All right.
Barry.
And Barry, thank you. Your video was cutting in and out. Thank you, Mr. Barry. All right, so motion passes. This will move forward to CPC. Our other consideration, I will say, probably should have started with this earlier. We had no registered speakers for today, Ms. May, is that correct? Thank you. And then other matters.
If they were, they've gone.
Did not have any. And no one is present here in the auditorium with us. So our other item is approval of our minutes from May 30th. Any comments to the minutes? Seeing none, is there a motion? Thank you, Vice Chair Blair, for your motion. Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Hall. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Minutes are adopted as submitted. Thank you. Do we have any further items, Ms. May?
No.
All right, seeing none, it is 12:30 p.m. Thank you all very much for your attendance and the robust discussion today on this item. Everyone have a good afternoon and look forward to seeing everyone at our next meeting. You're adjourned.
You have an idea for the next meeting.
Thank
The
you.
next meeting, August 1st. And
What are we gonna be discussing?
we're hoping